Chapter 342. Lionel sunk deep into the ground and summoned the segmented cube. Truth be told, he didn't feel 100% safe in this region. There was no telling what kind of powerful beasts could burrow through the ground. In addition, as things stood now, he was still being tracked. There was also no telling what those people would do with that information. Lionel shook his head and entered the abode setting. He had no idea how he could possibly get so unlucky to land himself in this situation. But here he was, he could only make the most of it. Could it be that something like this happened to Aina too? Lionel's heart suddenly clenched. He remembered that when he sent Aina here, they had quite literally just survived a bombing. It could even be argued that her state was worse than his current own. On top of that, she was severely injured and a beautiful woman alone in this world. There was no telling what could happen. Lionel thought back to that bad feeling he had had and clenched his teeth. A murderous aura seemed to still the air around him. Lionel hardly noticed it, nor did he realize when he could suddenly exude such bloodthirst. But all he knew was that if they dared to touch one hair on her head, he wouldn't care about what consequences going against them could bring. Lionel stripped himself of his clothes and began to slowly wash himself. It was hard to tell if he was being deliberate or not, but his movements were paced and methodical as though each and every one of his actions had the utmost importance. After a long while he was cleaned and refreshed. Then he entered his room and sank into his bed, falling asleep once again. Lionel awoke feeling better than he ever had. His body felt like a powerful spring, ready to launch itself into the skies. His injuries were completely healed, even ones hidden well within the depths of his being. And his mind was clear, even clearer than it had been after his first nap. With that, he entered the lab setting and set his sights on the many blueprints his father had left behind. Truthfully, these blueprints didn't have some powerful nation-rending treasures depicted on them. Rather, they were mostly written as guiders to Lionel's training. As such, most of them were actually related to aspects of forming divine armor, as it was an outrageously complicated process. The general rule of Force crafters was that treasures with more parts tended to be more complicated. So, one could imagine how difficult forming one's divine armor was. Even the simplest designs would have upwards of 40 to 50 parts, something that was far beyond the current Lionel. That said, Lionel wasn't looking toward these blueprints to start on his divine armor. As things stood now, that wasn't a valuable use of his time. Lionel scanned through and picked out a blueprint before unfurling it on his crafter's table. The design that revealed itself was a simple set of clothes that could provide decent defenses. At the very least, they wouldn't break so easily in battle and would also help Lionel stand out less. After all, the sweatpants of Earth looked quite odd in this new world. One of the most important parts about forming divine armor was understanding the human body and how it moved in relation to its parts. Tailoring clothing was one of the first steps that his father had laid out for him. Lionel memorized the blueprint and imprinted it into his mind using Dream Sculpt. Then he began to choose materials. Lionel's snow globes were filled with third-dimensional beasts thanks to his time on the Project Hunt Island. Picking out beasts with sturdy hides was just a matter of reaching out a finger and pointing. Like this, an odd scene of a naked boy tailoring his first set of clothing could be seen. Phew. Lionel patted down his robes, causing them to slam down against his body in a whipping motion. They had a heavy, leathery texture to them and were a deep black. They followed a similar design to the clothing of that star and cross organization and split at his waist. But, since Lionel didn't want to get into any unnecessary trouble, he only split it down once from just below his belly button. That way, the robes wouldn't obstruct his movements despite their heft. Compared to the robes, Lionel's pants were much looser and freer. They were made of an exceptionally light material and fluttered with the slightest movement. If one looked closely, it was clear that it wasn't the material that was light as much as the force arts Lionel wove into it made it so. Good enough. Lionel nodded to himself, slicking his hair back. His long hair was really getting to be a problem, but cutting it was even more difficult. In fact, as he progressed through strengthening his body, it only got tougher and tougher. Lionel no longer had the means to cut his hair even if he wanted to, as it seemed to be even more powerful than his body. Toward this issue, he could only shake his head and let his bronzed hair sway toward the small of his back. He could only hope he didn't become a male Rapunzel in the future. Lionel took off his robes, leaving him shirtless. Now that he had some real work to do, there was no need to leave such heavy protection on. Little Tolly shot up excitedly, bouncing across the table like a little silver basketball. Lionel smiled. Ever since Blackstar went into a deep sleep, this little one had been feeling lonely. Even though the two were always at each other's throats, Lionel could tell that they were a bit fond of one another. The main reason Lionel left his zone later than Monet and Violet Rain was because he had used his remaining time with Uncle Montez to infuse the mimicry blood into Little Blackstar. That way he could assure that absolutely nothing went wrong. So, right now, Little Blackstar was assimilating with the blood. But by the time Lionel finished, the little guy should be up and raring to go. Lionel took a deep breath and began to meditate. He was very close to reaching perfection in his crystallization. Once he did, it would be time. Chapter 343. The days slowly ticked by, but Lionel hardly noticed them. His body was as light as a feather, following along a natural progression that didn't even seem difficult to him. Then one day, bang! Shoo! A hot steam shot all around Lionel's body. Well, at first look it was just steam. But, upon second inspection, one would be shocked to find that it was actually force. Tangible force. This wasn't the kind of force only those with internal sight could see. Even mortals who hadn't come into contact with force a day in their lives would very clearly be able to see it. This sort of shocking crystallization was the likes of which even King Arthur hadn't reached. Lionel took a deep breath. All the dense fog around him seemed to surge into his body, entering through his pores and boring into his soul, leaving him feeling incomparably refreshed. I did it. This should also be the strong stage. Lionel realized that when his body suddenly sucked in all his force like that, his body broke through another shackle and reached the strong stage. It had to be remembered that refining one's metal body in the third dimension was split into 5 phases. The weak, standard, strong, superior and perfection stage. This could be considered the foundation one laid to enter the 4th dimension. This was another reason Lionel wasn't worried about not having the rest of dimensional cleanse just yet. Even if he couldn't progress to the 4th dimension with his force, he could still do so with his soul force, he could still comprehend the 4 seasons realm, and he could also bring his metal body into the 4th dimension as well. Regardless of which of these 3 paths it was, each of them would give him the strength of a 4th dimensional entity. So what did it matter? As things stood now, if Lionel wanted, he could bring his metal body to the 4th dimension this very instant. But, as a person who opened all 9 doors, how could he waste his potential like that? He had to reach superior stage at worst before progressing. Lionel flexed his forearms. My body is already nearing the strength of a pseudo 4th dimensional Oregon. It wouldn't be easy even for 4th dimensional entities to harm me. Lionel took a deep breath. This gave him even more assurance to form his 10th node. He knew that no matter how much he planned it all out, the process would still be impossibly painful. After all, he was trying to break through restrictions set by the universe itself. Even if this could be considered to be a minor restriction in the grand scheme, to the current Lionel, it was an insurmountable mountain. Lionel took a deep breath to adjust himself. Then he took another long bath and deep sleep before finally returning, his body brimming with vitality. No matter how you looked at him, Lionel seemed to be a pointed spear. All the hatred, humiliation and grievance he had suffered those few days ago seemed to become his whetstone, sharpening his edge to unimaginable degrees. Let's begin. Lionel spoke to no one in particular. His breath shot out like an arrow, trembling the space before his lips. He sat crossed-legged, a vial of thick, milky liquid in his hands. This was none other than the dew he had collected in the several months he had the stalactite for. Just a single drop was more than enough to form a node, but Lionel actually had almost a dozen. In that moment, Lionel began to circulate, dimensional cleanse in full force. The speed of his rotation his stars experienced accelerated and his body suddenly felt bloated. Lionel split his mind in 2 directions, both focusing in on his kidneys. Lionel had calculated everything out. If he tried to form his nodes one at a time, he would get stone-walled when he tried to form his 10th. The only chance he stood was to form them both at the very same time. For the current Lionel, splitting his mind in 2 directions was as easy as breathing. After crystallizing his spirit pressure to perfection, he could already split it over 8 ways. So, how could 2 possibly be an issue? Lionel guides his force, stimulating his life energies, rearranging the cells of kidneys. The kidney was an extraordinarily important part of the body. It was responsible for cleaning away many of the impurities of the blood. However, for anyone who had ever suffered a kidney stone before, they would know that even the smallest particle could cause everything to go wrong. For Lionel to rearrange his cells, though it wasn't as dangerous as when he had done so with his brain, the immediate pain was definitely far more potent. However, from the outside one would never guess that Lionel was in pain. In just an hour, Lionel had already rearranged 100 cells worth of space, creating a nice pocket for his 2 nodes. To this point, despite the pain, everything had gone perfectly. All he had to do now was form his node within the pockets he had created and connect them with his others. By then, his foundation within the third dimension would become perfect. Lionel's chest expanded, his thick force building. In one swift motion, he unhesitatingly swung his head back and gulped down the whole vial of dew. Bang! Lionel's body suddenly expanded by a size. However, it wasn't proportional in the slightest. He looked as though he had suddenly gained 100 pounds and that his body would burst at any moment. However, under the strength of his metal body, he kept himself together as his face contorted. Blood leaked from his lips, but he willed himself to focus. In that instant, all the force in his body rushed to two locations, carving out a node pathway with impunity. Lionel's brow trembled, but he bit down on his teeth hard. He compressed his bloated body, squeezing his muscles and flexing with all his might. Cracks began to spread not only across himself, but even the floors of the lab setting. It seemed that he might implode at any given moment. But it was exactly then that he felt the node pathways complete. One to his left kidney and the other to his right. Just when Lionel was about to feel ecstatic, he suddenly felt as though someone had stabbed through the right side of his body and twisted the knife. In that moment, a scar Lionel had hardly thought about his whole life suddenly lit on fire. From a faint mark near his liver, it suddenly exploded, radiating out with a blinding light. Ack! Lionel couldn't control his roar. The pain was so excruciating that his eyes rolled back until only their whites remained. His body convulsed uncontrollably. There was no need to even mention his breakthrough attempt. He had completely lost control of his force, his body bursting apart at its seams. He flopped to the ground, his body spasming as blood leaked from his orifices. The scar continued to burn brighter and brighter, stretching up the side of his body as though to swallow him whole. Lionel could have never thought that the reason he felt 9 nodes weren't enough was precisely because of this scar his father mentioned in the note he left to him all that time ago. Chapter 344. Lionel felt as though a blade was twisting through his organs. He had never experienced pain on this level in his entire life. It was to the point that no amount of will could keep his mind clear. Whatever semblance of control he had had over the process of his body had completely collapsed, resulting in a rampaging force surging throughout his body. Anyone else in this sort of situation would have long since died. In fact, the moment they swallowed that amount of dew, they would have exploded on the spot. That said, Lionel's current situation had little to nothing to do with the amount of force he had swallowed. In fact, it had nothing to do with him trying to form a 10th node either. It was entirely related to the twisting pain at his hip. To this point, Lionel still had no idea why his father ever mentioned the scar above his hip. Lionel had never been aware of where it came from. Considering he played football, he had never thought much about it to begin with. Injuries always seemed to pop up randomly for anyone who played the sport. He had even broken his ribs during the last game he played. Why would he think so much about a barely visible scar? However, Lionel could have never imagined that such a small matter would blow up to this level. Lionel's mind was completely blank. His eyes had rolled back, making his vision completely black. It felt as though the only thing he could feel was pain, the only thing he could hear were his screams, the only thing he could smell was the metallic stench of his own blood. Then it all began to turn faint. As though his life was being pulled along by a string completely out of his control, he stalked closer toward death. And maybe the worst part was that Lionel wasn't even aware. Maybe it was because his will wasn't tempered enough, maybe it was because this pain was truly beyond the limits of his body, but there was nothing he could do to change his own fate. As Lionel was straddling the line of life and death, Scythe had finally gotten the report he had been waiting several days for. After reading it, he furrowed his brow. With the level of their organization, digging up information on a mere third-dimensional existence was too easy. However, Lionel's information was too weird. For one, his grandfather was the emperor of his world. Having a world unified beneath one force was incredibly rare to begin with. It was an extraordinary feat and it was impossible for any simple existence to accomplish this, especially when it was a world with so much talent like Earth. This alone wasn't enough to cause Scythe to frown. Who cared about the emperor of a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world? He might find it troublesome if Earth was a pseudo-fifth-dimensional world, but they were very clearly far from this. What made him raise an eyebrow wasn't the information but rather, the lack of it. Firstly, there wasn't a single hint of information about Lionel's maternal grandmother and Emperor Fox's wife. It was to the point they hadn't even managed to find her name. No birth records, no name, no death certificate, nothing. As though that wasn't enough, his mother had vanished off the face of the planet. She hadn't been heard of in decades. In fact, the time she had disappeared for far outstripped Lionel's own age, which was more than enough to raise some eyebrows. Then there was Lionel's father. Rather than vanishing, the issue with him was that he appeared out of nowhere. There were records that were very clearly forged of his birth and early life, but it was all too simple for Scythe's organization to find out how fake these things were. On top of that, he suddenly vanished after the metamorphosis began. There wasn't a single record of him, nothing. Even this aside, there was Lionel himself. To summarize the boy as a troublemaker was an understatement. The near destruction of a fort, the murder of several hidden family members, the falling out with the rebels of Earth, of course, none of these things were enough to move Scythe. What did he care what a teen did against such weak organizations? The real issue was how all of this fit together. There were a lot of organizations eyeing Earth right now. In fact, even without the mission he was given, Scythe already had Earth on his radar. This was simply one of those things the public was in the dark about, while those with some real weight to them were already taking advantage of. What Scythe wanted to know was whether or not Lionel and his mysterious family was part of those eyeing Earth as a pie they wanted a slice of. If this was the case, then Scythe might very well become a scapegoat in a power struggle simply by virtue of the fact he was unlucky enough to be saddled with this mission. Thinking to this point, Scythe's sunken eyes narrows, his already pale features growing a shade whiter. When he entered such deep thought, his blood seemed to slow by a measure, making him appear to be even more ghost-like. No matter what actions I take now, they have to be done with the utmost secrecy. Scythe knew that he didn't have the option to reject this mission. This was simply the plight of the weak. However, he also knew that his organization wouldn't throw him out to dry either. If they set such a precedent, it wouldn't be long before no one was willing to work for them. This ultimately meant that he needed to set a seed of appropriate amounts of doubt. As long as there wasn't conclusive evidence that he was the one who acted, he should be able to keep a certain level of protection for himself. Where is he now? Scythe finally turned the attendant who still knelt on the ground. From our information, he has long since left Earth using a teleportation ticket. But, since these tickets can only teleport someone within a quadrant, there were only about 200 worlds he could have gone to. After looking through the teleportation records of them all, there are 5 worlds that fit the timing and only one registered to Lionel Morales. He should be on terrain coordinate XX. XX at the moment. Scythe nodded. Prepare everything. I want to leave within the hour. Yes. Chapter 345. Scythe landed on the teleportation platform. Instead of looking around toward his surroundings, he frowned for a moment and closed his eyes, slowly regaining his bearing. Despite the fact this was a private teleportation pad in the most secretive location the organization had to offer, there were already 2 individuals ready to receive Scythe. Neither said a word as Scythe regained his bearings, and neither did Scythe acknowledge them. Had Lionel been there, he would have immediately recognized these 2 as the very same male and female pair that had branded him with the mark that now hovered over his forehead. When Scythe finally opened his eyes, the 2 of them stepped forward. Officer Finn greets Commander. Officer Thorn greets Commander. Scythe looked toward the 2 of them indifferently. The title of officer was just another way of saying unranked in their organization, while these officers all referred to those above them as Commander. It was similar to how some cultures called even those unrelated to them uncle or big brother, but in this case, rather than being a polite address, it was a way of drawing a line between true members of the organization and those who weren't worthy. I received information that a certain Lionel Morales came through this city. You have 10 minutes to get me information about his whereabouts and other pertinent information. You may leave. Finn and Thorn froze, looking toward each other with their heads still bowed. Scythe frowned. What? He could clearly see that there was something wrong. The male officer, Finn, looked up carefully and explained everything from start to finish. The most recent information we have of him is that he has left the city. If Commander wants, we can use the monitoring brand to retrieve him. The truth was that these 2 officers hadn't put much stock in Lionel. Though they branded him, that was a matter of convenience rather than necessity. They knew well that the matter was an inconvenience to Lionel and also knew that it was unnecessary to go so far. But so what? Who cared how Lionel felt about it? Never could they have expected that someone like Scythe would personally descend for someone they put no importance on. When Scythe heard the story, his frown couldn't help but deepen. Now, this matter he had been hoping to keep under wraps was likely the talk of much of the city. This alone might have been fine, but the real problem was that now Lionel's conflict with their organization was public. There was no getting rid of this stain. Even if there was no direct evidence, if Lionel's mysterious backing was strong enough, they might not give a damn and kill those responsible anyway. This was the kind of power true strength could give someone. Scythe's frown deepened, causing Thorn and Finn to break out into a cold sweat. Even the usually expressionless Thorn couldn't help but tremble. After a while, Scythe's frown smoothed out. Since others could use him as a scapegoat, why couldn't he do the same? Who said he had to get directly involved? It was already a problem that he had come here personally. But there was good news as well. For one, he had come through a private port. Secondly, because he was trying to be secretive to begin with, these two were the only ones who knew about his arrival. And, coincidentally, these two were the only ones with direct contact and interaction with Lionel as well. This made things as perfect and watertight as they could be. Good. Scythe suddenly spoke. Make sure to monitor him closely, very closely. Should he show any signs of stepping out of line, don't hesitate to punish him according to the law. I will be doing an inspection on this branch for the next while. Do as you usually do. With that, Scythe walked by the two officers and disappeared down the corridor, leaving the two of them stunned. They weren't sure how they were supposed to take this information. Was there a hidden meaning? Were they supposed to take it at face value? What do we do? Finn's confident sneer was nowhere to be seen. He looked more like a wounded pup who had been abandoned by his owner. Thorn remained silent for a long while. Clearly she too was confused. In the end she spoke hesitantly. This may be a test. The first thing Commander asked about when he came to was about this Lionel character. It's clear that his goal in coming here was related to this young man. But he became apprehensive after hearing we already had dealings with him. On top of that, Commander came through the private pad only used in special circumstances. It's obvious that Commander wants to use us as scapegoats. It's clear that this Lionel's background isn't as simple as we once thought. Finn shivered at these words. It seemed that he too had already thought of this, it was just that he didn't want to believe it. But this is still an opportunity. Thorn said slowly. If we can kill this Lionel secretly or manage to kill him in an above-board manner without bending or violating any rules, I think there's a chance we can turn this disaster into a chance to rise up the ranks. Finn clenched his jaw. It's already impossible to kill him secretly. The only chance is to use the latter option. Agreed. The only question was, how could they manipulate this Lionel into making a mistake worth his life? Deep within the corridor, Scythe, who the two thought had already left, curled his lip. It seems he was quite satisfied with the conclusion the two officers had come to. With that, he turned and truly walked away completely. This is still interesting though. Scythe thought to himself. This branch seems to be on high alert for fugitives, but why be on alert to the point of coincidentally arresting a third-dimensional ant? It was quite the coincidence indeed. Their organization had two conflicts with Lionel, neither related to the other. It seemed that there was something interesting going on in this quadrant. Since he was here, he might as well dip a toe in and profit as well. What the two officers and Scythe had no idea about was that as they were speaking, the young man they were plotting the death of was already at death's door. Lionel lied convulsing in a pool of his own blood. By now, little Tali was hopping around anxiously, but the little guy had no idea what to do. The scar along Lionel's side seemed to be growing more and more vicious with each passing moment. From afar, it looked as though Lionel was boiling from the inside out. The scar was like a burning hot coal, shining with a blazing red-orange light. It was at that moment that an already terrible situation seemed to get worse. The scar finally stopped growing and began to rapidly shrink. But with this shrinkage came a violent suction energy. Not only was Lionel's own blood suddenly swallowed from around him, but the vitality within his body was being rapidly drained. Soon, Lionel went from a human that was bursting at the seams to a skeleton without an ounce of meat left on his body. His eyes sunk in, their whites flickering about wildly. He looked like he was truly at his end. Chapter 346. Lionel's skin pressed flush against his bone. Soon it began to crackle and dry like a thin piece of paper. It even seemed like it just might crack like fine glass and perish into a pile of ash at any moment. It was only then that something changed. Batum. Batum. Lionel's chest jolted so violently that it seemed like his heart might leap from his chest. The outline of his ribs were so clear in his current state that it was even vaguely possible to see the sudden activity. His convulsing body shook once more. This time, a projectile of black blood shot out from his mouth as a familiar heat spread all through Lionel's body. If Lionel was conscious, his mind would flash back to the days he spent with his father and a disgusting green smoothie he had to force down his throat every day. Lionel had believed that he already understood the purpose of his father's concoctions. They had helped his body strengthen faster than others after the metamorphosis, despite the fact he wasn't born with an offensive or physical ability. Yet, he could have never thought that these benefits were just mere lingering aftereffects. They couldn't even represent a single % of what their true strength was. At that moment, three things began to occur in Lionel's body at once. In his left kidney, a large force node of 100 cells had connected with the rest of his body and began to shimmer in full force. In his ethereal glabella, a sudden surge of soul force began to spin violently around itself, quickly forming a third star that sent pulses of pure energy outward. In his right kidney, a golden red stone began to form. It was more accurate to say that it had begun to reform. And it was much larger than any one of Lionel's other nodes. In fact, it didn't seem like a normal node at all. Lionel hadn't realized it before, but a portion of his kidney had been cut out. But it had been such a small portion that even when he swept his internal sight over it, he hadn't noticed a thing. It could be said that it only took up the space of a few thousand cells. However, at this moment, not only was the space that had been cut out suddenly filled with a heavy, swirling golden red energy, but it slowly matured, taking over the whole of Lionel's right kidney until it completely morphed. In a process that took several days, Lionel's right kidney turned from a normal organ of flesh and blood to a gem shimmering of gold and scarlet. It was clear that whatever had been cut out of Lionel had not only recovered, but it had also strengthened by countless times compared to the past. But what was most shocking was the fact it took the place of Lionel's 10th node, but was very clearly several times larger than his other nodes. The kidney might not have been a particularly large organ, but it was still formed of hundreds of thousands to millions of cells. Compared to the 100 cells that formed Lionel's other nodes, there wasn't even an appropriate comparison. In addition, compared to the force that usually swirled about Lionel's nodes and nodal pathways, this energy was several levels above anything Lionel had ever come into contact with before. It seemed that Lionel's father had gone a bit overboard in helping his son to recover. By normal convention, Lionel would have eventually helped his kidney mature to this state over a long period of time, but it seemed like this would no longer be necessary. At that moment, the violent changes to Lionel's body slowly came to a stop. As his 3-star constitution completed, a surge of black, putrid liquid flowed out from his pores and mouth, filling the lab setting with a terrible stench. At the same time, the golden red energy of his right kidney seemed to connect with the rest of his body, causing a purification effect that even managed to match the formation of Lionel's 3rd star in a casual manner. And finally, Lionel's body, after going through so much, broke through another barrier and entered the superior stage. It was within his body that the most drastic changes began to occur. Whether by design or coincidence, the golden red energy of Lionel's kidney seemed to resonate with the residual red energy of his runes. Back when Lionel had almost failed and suffered bloodline deviation, he had managed to turn back in the end, but that experience still left a small influence on him. This was why instead of a pure violet, when he entered his true battle state, his eyes would also contain a tinge of red. This redness seemed to be beloved by the energy of Lionel's kidney, and they became attracted to one another. Soon, the slight redness of Lionel's runes became more pronounced. At the same time, the bronze color grew in luster and tended slightly more toward gold. The changes weren't escaped by Lionel's hair, which also became more gold as it actually managed to survive the formation of his 3rd star this time around. But maybe the greatest changes occurred in Lionel's ethereal glabella. At that moment, the faint spirit of his snowy star owl seemed to also be influenced. In fact, compared to Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor, it resonated with this scarlet gold energy on a much deeper level, even to the point of causing faint changes within the 12-sided star. As all these changes continued to take place, Lionel remained in a deep sleep. During that time, the spirit of the segmented cube seemed to not like the fact its insides had been so dirted. So, Lionel was swept up and thrust into the bathhouse of the abode setting. While the mess he left behind was cleaned, Lionel suddenly gasped awake, his hands erratically touching around his own body as though to make sure it was all still there. It was only then he sighed a breath of relief and realized he had somehow ended up in bed. Did I fail? Lionel sighed. Even if he failed, he thought himself lucky. After all, surviving in such a situation was likely borderline impossible. Hold on, Lionel frowned. If he had failed, why was he uninjured? Could it be that he had only managed to form one node? That was worse than failing altogether, because that meant he had no chance of forming his 10th now. Lionel couldn't help but feel a bit down. He sat up, crossing his legs and sinking into meditation. He might as well check the state of his body. He had always known that this was a nearly impossible endeavor, but for whatever reason he had never even considered failure. Chapter 347. The first thing Lionel noticed was that his force was somewhat tinged with red. At first he thought that this was a product of forming his third star. But when he checked on the situation of his kidneys, he was left speechless. It became very obvious very quickly that the reddish-gold energy was coming from his right kidney, which shimmered like a gem within his body. What the hell? Lionel's hand suddenly shot toward his scar, his gaze flashing with an imperceptible light. The truth was that Lionel had never thought much about his scar. He had learned about it from his father's note, but that had been before he even stepped into the Mayan tomb. By the time he went through so many life and death situations and got his hands on the dictionary, something he could finally use to find out more about it, it wasn't even on his mind any longer. As a result, Lionel never got around to asking, innate force node? When Lionel's mind landed on these words, he was suddenly jolted out of his stupor. He remembered that the first time he learned about innate force nodes he had been reading Dimensional Cleanse. The creator had mentioned them and even said that created force nodes were no weaker. But looking at his right kidney, Lionel had a hard time imagining that his self-created force nodes could match up. Whether it was in size, quality, or robustness, his right kidney far outstripped anything he had ever come across. In fact, it was an even higher quality than his light elemental force, which was an exceptionally high-level energy to begin with. Lionel frowned. Did this scar mean that someone had planted this force node into him? But why had he not noticed it until now? And what was with it being so large? Are all innate force nodes this large? Lionel reached out with his internal strength and tried to communicate with his right kidney's node. Ack! A searing pain suddenly shot through Lionel's body. Just a wisp of the force made him feel as though his body would burn to ash if he continued for even a split second more. Lionel broke out into a cold sweat, collapsing. What the hell? He couldn't even use his own innate force node? What kind of joke was this? Lionel had no idea that he had reawakened his innate force node much earlier than his father had expected. Lionel wasn't supposed to try and form a 10th node. That was simply suicidal. The fact he tried at all was enough for people to look at him as though he was a madman. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately depending on the perspective, his actions catalyzed the rebirth of his innate force node. But it also made it far more powerful than he was prepared to deal with. Lionel gave up, taking out the dictionary. He really had no idea what was happening. What is going on? Lionel couldn't even come up with pointed questions, he could only ask this. Ever since he left the turbulence of Camelot, the dictionary had begun to work just fine once again. Ping. After a long while of listening and many more specific questions, Lionel came to understand. His innate force node hadn't been planted into him. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Someone had operated on him as a child and taken it out. When Lionel wanted to find out more about this, the dictionary practically cut him out. The only understanding he managed to grasp was that it wasn't his father's family that had done so, and even that was only done through various deductions. Still, in the end, the innate force node was Lionel's to begin with. It was written into his very being. It just needed a catalyst to rebirth itself. In the end, that catalyst came much earlier than anyone could have ever expected. Finally, Lionel learned about just what this energy was. Ping. Scarlet Star Force. Lionel, who was still in a bit of a bad mood after learning he had been operated on without his knowledge as a child, raised his eyebrows. What is that force? Ping. Replying to Seed, Scarlet Star Force is a mutated light elemental force that has gained characteristics of fire elemental force and star elemental force. It's a balance of all three that creates an all-new energy that ranks among the top of all three elemental types. Where does it rank amongst the three? Ping. It ranks top 10 of star elemental forces. It ranks top 3 within light elemental forces. It ranks number 1 within fire elemental forces. Lionel was shocked. This was the first time the dictionary had given him such a definitive answer about the strength of something. The fact its answer was so decisive and clear made Lionel realize that his Scarlet Star Force was likely something beyond his imagining. After taking several deep breaths to calm himself, Lionel asked the final question he had on his mind. What abilities is Scarlet Star Force known for? Ping. Destruction. Lionel plopped down on his bed, a hint of shock playing his features. It was a clean, direct, and unconfusing answer. It couldn't have been more forcefully outlined. And Lionel believed it with his very being. His Scarlet Star Force wasn't as simple as causing damage with oppressive heat or strong power. Lionel quite literally felt his cells quake whenever he observed the energy, as though they didn't even want to live anymore. This level of force, this quality of energy, it held a mystery to it that was far beyond what the current Lionel could grasp. Even after just observing it for a moment, Lionel felt as though shackles within his mind were loosening, and the feeling was just as profound as the fourth-dimensional force art within his dream world. The only exception was that this Scarlet Star Force was only trying to teach him one thing instead of a myriad of things: how to destroy. Just when Lionel wanted to experiment to see what his true limits were, he froze, his gaze shooting up to the ceiling of his room. Someone was above him. Chapter 348. What is it, Uncle Zimo? Why did we stop? The voice of a young lady came out from the midst of an escort. In fact, it wasn't just any young lady but rather Syl, the friend of the woman who was the cause of Lionel's current predicament, but also, ironically, maybe the reason Lionel was still alive. The escort was quite long, containing at least 50 individuals. Aside from one large chariot which Syl's voice came from, the rest rode odd war horses with twin horns and an underbelly covered in thick scales. Uncle Zimo was the very same older man with sparse hair that had taken Syl away from Ree just days ago. But, at the moment, he stood in place at the head of the escort, his hands folded to his back and his gaze narrowed. The issue was that he seemed to be staring into empty space. Other than an unkempt road before him amidst a thick forest, there was nothing else. Just when everyone was beginning to think Uncle Zimo had gone crazy, the ground trembled slightly and a young man slowly appeared. For a moment, it seemed as though the whole of the world revolved around him. The young man wore heavy leather robes that exuded the wild air of a beast. His hair, shimmering of gold and bronze, swayed slightly beneath the wind, accentuating his sharp, handsome features. Though his eyes were colored a dull green, they held a hidden sharpness within them that remained calm even in the face of such a large group. It was clear that this young man was still in the third dimension. Anyone with internal sight could see the faint rejection of the world around him. Yet, somehow, the pressure he exuded was so far beyond that. Uncle Zimo's gaze narrowed. "Is there a reason you called me out?" Lionel questioned. Despite the numerous eyes on him, his voice was steady and calm. However, it seemed to break an illusion everyone had just been under. Whether it was by coincidence or design, the aura of the previous Lionel had made everyone ignore a few things. For one, no one had noticed the little mink around his neck until now. And, most importantly, no one had noticed the black mark that hovered before his forehead until now as well. Upon realizing this, Uncle Zimo's expression became more hostile than it already was, causing Lionel to frown. Lionel was getting really tired of people being hostile to him just because of this mark on his forehead. He had even left the city only for this nonsense to happen anyway. The worst part was that Lionel was certain that he was no match for this man. He didn't know enough about the fourth dimension to properly measure this man's stats, but all he needed to know was that this Uncle Zimo was far stronger than his previous self. As for how his current self would stack up, Lionel had no idea. He hadn't even had a chance to measure his limits. Uncle Zimo took a step forward, causing Lionel's furrowed brows to darken. "I suggest you watch yourself. I'm not in the greatest of moods," Lionel said coldly. "If you insist on attacking me without reason, I'll ensure that your whole escort is swarmed by beasts and invalids." Lionel's sudden words stunned Uncle Zimo. Maybe he had never expected someone within the third dimension to speak to him like this. There weren't many even within the fourth dimension who dared to say such words. However, Lionel was clearly not in the mood to mind his feelings. First he was branded like a slave. Then he was forced out of the city without a place to sleep. Then he almost died during his breakthrough, only to find out that someone had snatched something that was his as a child. Even though he had gotten it back now with Lionel's personality, he was still more than just a little pissed. And now, instead of crossing over him without a word, this damned old man stopped the whole escort just to bring him out from the ground and suddenly wanted to target him for something that wasn't his fault? Lionel found that his patience for nonsense was getting shorter and shorter as time passed. The longer he spent in this new world order, the more his charismatic, easy-going self was whittled away. Uncle Zimo's shocked appearance suddenly gave way to a sneer and then laughter. It wasn't just him, many of the soldiers and warriors within the escort couldn't hold it in any longer. Yet, Lionel didn't seem to have heard their mocking chuckling. He flipped his palm over, a deep black bow appearing in his hand. Even the sun that peeked through the heavy foliage above could only be wholly absorbed by its surface. The little mink on Lionel's shoulder bared its little fangs, growling. Lionel's aura seemed to change once more, sharpening. A slightly cold wind circled around him, causing the dried leaves at his feet to swirl about. He casually knocked an arrow and faced the escort, his indifferent gaze locking onto Zimo. It was clear in an instant that he wasn't joking in the slightest. If this old man continued to piss him off, he really would do something. Uncle Zimo stopped laughing and frowned. Do you really think any beast would be attracted by your mere third-dimensional force? Do you think I would need my fourth-dimensional force to deal with you? Do you think this is a fairy tale? Lionel's gaze remained without expression. It was as though he hadn't heard Zimo's words at all. His entire demeanor seemed to say, try me. His own third-dimensional force wouldn't attract invalids here, but what if he activated his Winter Four Seasons realm comprehension? He had already reached the pinnacle of crystallization. What if he broke into the fourth dimension with his soul force right here? And even if he ignored all of that, what about his Scarlet Star force? Was there a beast or invalid in the world that could withstand its temptation? At this point, Lionel was truly daring Zimo to act. He would gladly bury this arrogant prick right here. At the same time, Uncle Zimo was growing more and more pissed. A mere third-dimensional ant actually dared to speak to him this way? The worst part was that he really didn't dare to call Lionel out on his bluff. Even if he truly believed Lionel was spewing nothing but nonsense, he had a responsibility to protect Zimo. Even if there was only a 1% chance, he was trained to not risk it. His gaze turned hard as he stared down Lionel, but the latter met his gaze without a worry. It's you? Suddenly, a voice cut through the atmosphere. Lionel frowned. Not only did he recognize the voice, just hearing it made him more pissed than he already was. At that moment, two women peeked out from the carriage, one of whom was Ree, the very woman who caused much of Lionel's troubles in this world. The moment she spoke, Lionel's glare landed on her, causing her trouble breathing to come back several folds stronger. She nearly collapsed where she stood. Uncle Zimo suddenly took a step forward, but SHU. He had hardly moved when an arrow landed barely a centimeter before his foot. In that instant he froze. This wasn't because he felt the danger of the arrow. It was slow, and for someone like him, dodging it would have been possible. The issue was that he hadn't even finished lifting his foot when the arrow landed before him right in the area he had wanted to step toward. The awkward sudden stop shifted his momentum backward, causing an arrow that wouldn't have been lethal to him regardless to make him look ridiculous. Lionel's gaze left Ree and landed back on Uncle Zimo, his expression becoming even colder. Now that he knew this escort was led by that woman, his impression of them was even worse. Boy. Zimo's voice came out in a low growl. Uncle Zimo, stop. Sill's voice suddenly calmed the atmosphere once again. Young man, how about we have a chat? Lionel frowned and looked away from Zimo once again. What did this woman want? Chapter 349. Sill was a bit off-put by Lionel's reaction. What young man wouldn't want to have a talk with a beauty like her? What was his issue? However, with her noble upbringing, it was impossible for such thoughts to cross her face. In fact, they were just fleeting thoughts of hers she didn't spend much time on to begin with. Did you not hear her? Just when Lionel was thinking of what he should be doing, a young man riding one of those odd war steeds glared toward Lionel. It was clear that he was very much unsatisfied with Lionel's attitude. What the hell is wrong with these people? Lionel almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. It was as though everyone who he met made it their duty to piss him off. If you want to speak with me, there's nothing wrong with the current arrangement. I would hate to get attacked again just for breathing the same air as you. Lionel said indifferently. Sill was even more stunned by these words, while Zimo's expression darkened. As for the young man who spoke out, his hands slid to the sword by his side. It seemed that he too was losing his patience. No one seemed to realize that Lionel's words were correct, even if they were somewhat rude. He had just been dragged up from deep within the earth just because he happened to be along their way. Who knew what would happen if he actually accepted this advice? He didn't have a death wish. The only reason Lionel set himself up so close to the road to begin with was because beasts tended to avoid the human population, so they would be less likely to be near where humans frequented. But he didn't expect this logical choice to land him in trouble. Ree stomped her feet. He's so rude, Sill. Just get Uncle Zimo to beat him up so we can leave. Lionel's gaze swept over Ree once more, causing the rest of her words to get caught in her throat. Whatever she meant to say came out in a whimper, dying in her chest. Sill comforted Ree for a moment before peeking back through the window of the carriage. She observed Lionel for a long while. She couldn't help but be curious, plus she felt a bit guilty. She had happened to overhear some of the things Lionel had suffered through in the city thanks to the actions of her friend. The fact he was hostile wasn't too much of a surprise. It could even be said it was partly her fault for giving Ree an inside path toward a job she wasn't qualified for. Sill hesitated. I'm in need of a guard. The pay is quite good if you're interested. Zemo's expression changed. Guard? What better guard was there than him? Even if he failed, there were still 50 others. And even if those 50 failed, there were still the hand-selected youths for this important event. And even if by some act of a god all of this failed, there were still the life-saving measures she had as the young miss of a preeminent family. What need did she have for a third-dimensional guard? The young man riding the war horse by Sill's carriage carried the worst expression. How did asking for a new guard reflect on himself? But Lionel's words made it all worse. I have no interest in being a bodyguard. I only want to leave this place without being targeted, Lionel said plainly. Though he was in need of an organization to gain information from, Lionel had no interest in this nonsense. He had to figure out a way to find Aina or at least get her to find him, and joining a group with so much clear hostility toward him was the last thing he wanted to do. Sil was once again stumped. She tried to be nice, but if Lionel didn't want it, there was no way for her to force him to accept her kindness. Of course, if Lionel knew her thoughts, he would think she thought too much of herself. It was an act of kindness for him to act as her guard? Compared to those here, even if his physical strength couldn't match up, his internal sight was most definitely unmatched. His ability to keep her safe by avoiding danger alone would be better than everyone here. Even if it wasn't about his internal sight, Lionel was starting to get a better and better understanding of his talent and how it matched up to others the longer he spent in this new world order. Maybe in a time as short as a month, Sil wouldn't have the face to ask him for such a thing. After a moment of being flustered, Sil still didn't know how to respond. It was then that something no one could have expected to happened. Zyler, your quota is revoked. Young man, I would like for you to take his place in representing our Kiafur family. What do you think? The young man riding the odd-scaled war horse froze. All the animosity and hatred he had on his face was suddenly washed away by despair. The delicate voice sounded from within the carriage. Though Lionel couldn't see who had spoken, he felt as though her words manifested into a painting of her image. It was gorgeous, pure and flawless, riding the cool wind like a fragrant breeze. Lionel didn't know why, but he was compelled to say yes almost immediately. However, everyone else was shocked beyond belief. Let alone Zyler, even Sil, who had wanted to take Lionel as a bodyguard, and Zemo, who had wanted to kill Lionel just a moment ago, stood frozen. Lionel might not have known who had just spoken, but they knew well who it was. She was none other than the future matriarch of the family, the woman both Ree and Sil called sister-in-law, and the wife of Sil's only elder brother, Mistress Era. Compared to Sil, the word of this woman was practically law. Since she had spoken, things were practically final. It was to the point where even if Lionel wanted to run, Zemo wouldn't allow him to. In fact, it was to the point that any hostility Zemo had toward Lionel could only be buried deep within his heart. Realizing the sudden change in the atmosphere, Lionel seemed to understand that turning this offer down wasn't an option. But what was this quota this woman spoke of? What mess had he been thrust into this time? Chapter 350. Lionel sat in the carriage completely expressionless, as though he couldn't sense the numerous glares coming at him from the outside. The truth was that if he was a bit less thick-skinned, he would be embarrassed as well. He was currently the only man within the carriage, and the reason for this was quite embarrassing as well. He really hated riding horses. Lionel sat in a corner to himself, ignoring the fragrance that hung in the air. He had never been very moved by such things to begin with. Even the beautiful Mistress Era only caught his attention for a moment before he didn't glance her way again. Indeed, she was quite beautiful. In fact, it seemed that Lionel would meet a new most beautiful woman he had ever seen every other month. It was as though they all grew on trees and were being picked for him in terms of quality. But Lionel knew that the truth was that the more powerful the woman, the more beautiful they seemed to be. This was likely just a matter of evolution. Era, though, seemed to be particularly fairy-like. A head of flowing white hair, two crystal-like, shimmering blue eyes, a delicately sculpted nose. Everything down from the slight blush of her cheeks to the slenderness of her fingers were all perfectly sculpted to enrapture a man. It somehow made Lionel think of Aina, not for their similarities but for their differences. Lionel's memory of Aina wasn't as beautiful. In fact, even when Aina wore dresses and portrayed the image of a shy, reserved lady, he had always noticed her tan skin. Of course, on Earth, women took tanning as a trend, at least in the western parts of the world. This was a trend that held strong from the 21st century even to this current point. But Lionel knew that Aina wasn't the type of person to artificially tan herself or lounge out in the sun. Subconsciously, he always knew that her tan must have come from something else. In fact, it was precisely because of Anus Tan that Lionel first became interested in her, and his curiosity eventually got the best of him. Lost in thought, Lionel suddenly smiled. It seemed he missed her quite a lot. He longed to fight side by side with her again. Those warriors who caught sight of Lionel's smile through the window were stunned before feeling furious again, especially when they saw that Ri and Sil had entered somewhat of a daze. Lionel didn't seem to notice the reactions of the others around him as he closed his eyes, entering a state of meditation as he allowed the little mink to cuddle in his arms. At that moment, it seemed as though the air around him had subtly changed. Though he wanted to ask about what he had just gotten himself into, since Mistress Era hadn't said a word, he could only remain silent as well. With his dream world he could still improve himself without moving an inch. As Lionel fell into meditation, Ri looked somewhat jealously toward the little mink in his arms, causing Sil to giggle. "For someone who claims to be scared of him, you sure interact with him a lot," she said teasingly. Ri pouted. "I just wanted to pet it, why couldn't I just pet it?" Little Black Star opened one of its eyes to look at Ri before closing it and ignoring her once again. This disregard almost made her stamp her foot in rage. Era remained silent throughout the antics of the two girls, sending a curious gaze toward Lionel. Interesting, she thought, smiling to herself. Lionel's mind fully entered his dream world. At the moment he could split his mind 9 ways, so he put one to the task of monitoring the surroundings of his main body while the rest immersed themselves. "I've mastered 300 spears to now. If I want to completely grasp the chain domain, I still have 1700 more to go." Lionel sighed. It took him months to reach that 300 or so spear mark. It would probably take him years to finish comprehending just a singular spear domain, yet that wasn't even a single % of the spears within the spear domain ring. If only I could break through now. Lionel knew that his ability was directly tied to his soul force. If he broke through to the 4th dimension with it, his ability would definitely evolve to an all-new level. But it was simply too dangerous to do this in the wilderness. This was the real reason Lionel swallowed all of that dew in one go previously. He didn't want to risk running out of force and having to pull from the atmosphere. If he did, he would have probably been swarmed and died. Unfortunately, he had no dew left. And even if he did, the dew wasn't compatible with his soul force as it was normal force. In addition, it was only of the 3rd dimension, not the 4th, so it was completely unhelpful. Lionel shook his head. If he hadn't been kicked out of the city, this wouldn't have been a problem. But life wasn't fair. Maybe I should just try to dream sculpt those 4 seasons force arts? Lionel rejected this idea immediately. He would need to bring them out from the snow globes in order to do this. Someone as sharp as Era would definitely see through their specialness. By then, it'd be a wonder if he could even keep them. Lionel wasn't foolish enough to simply believe Era was a good person just because she was beautiful and had a pleasing voice. Then it seems my only option is to focus on comprehending the changes to my body and comprehending more spears. Lionel shook his head. There were really too many things limiting him. Wait. Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. He looked up toward the very top of his dream world, locking eyes with a massive sphere of force arts. With a thought, a spear manifested in Lionel's hands. It was adorned by feathers and seemed quite light to the touch. In addition, it was wildly flexible, waving about at the slightest movement of Lionel's wrist. It felt more like a loose string or a whip than a spear. This was one of the spears that Lionel had yet to master. Lionel locked eyes with the spherical force art and suddenly brandished the spear. He instantly fell into a state of enlightenment. What he didn't know was that at the very instant he did, Era's gaze suddenly shot open like an eagle. The air around Lionel had changed once again. Auspicious air? Chapter 351. Auspicious Air. Ancient Aura. Heavenly Enlightenment. It went by many names across just as many worlds. But, regardless of what it was called, the rarity of it didn't change at all. Even the normally calm and unflustered Era couldn't help but be shocked at this moment. It was to the point her eyes widened uncontrollably. "Sist." Era raised her slender finger to her pink lips, shushing Sil. It seemed that she was afraid of waking Lionel from such a rare state. It was clear that she had no idea that Lionel had entered this state by choice, and it wasn't a mere rare chance. It was something beyond that. A few minutes later, the air around Lionel suddenly vanished and he woke up within his dream world. At that moment he too was stunned. 3 minutes? It took 3 minutes? Lionel was shocked. Usually it would take him a few hours to master a spear if he went all out. In truth, this was already shockingly fast. If others came to know he could do this, there was no telling what kind of sensation it would cause. However, Lionel came to realize that as he climbed the hill, the more difficult it became and the more hours he had to pour in to master these spears. Before he realized it, a few months had passed and he had only mastered 300 or so of the over 2,000 he needed to. But this took him only 3 minutes. The most shocking part was that he had only comprehended with one mind. What if he split his mind 8 ways and reflected on the force art from 8 different directions at once? Era sighed. It only lasted a few minutes, but that would be enough for him to meditate on for a lifetime. He's quite a lucky child. Era almost choked. Lionel entered the state again. Her elegant demeanor was suddenly thrust out the window. Lionel began to experiment. Would it be more efficient to comprehend numerous spells at once? Or meditate on the same spear? What about if he spent 4 mind splits on one spear and 4 on another? What if he spent 2 on each spear? Lionel exhausted all these options, hopping into and out of a state Era thought was nearly impossible to touch in the first place. By the end of it all, she felt so numb that she may very well have been close to losing her mind. Sil and Ree watched this scene play out from the side, completely stunned. They didn't know what had happened to their elegant and refined sister-in-law to make her act like this. In truth, Era's reactions weren't very exaggerated. To other people they could only be considered to be a slight reaction. Maybe a slight opening of her pink lips, a slight raise of her brows, a slight twitch at the corner of her eyes and lashes. However, for Era this was the equivalent of her jaw dropping to the floor. Of course, Lionel had no idea what these women were feeling. He wouldn't care even if he knew. After all, the force art was within his dream world, which was essentially just a projection of his memories in his mind. It was impossible for anyone to take from him. Is this his ability? Era finally concluded. When Era came to this conclusion, she sucked in a cold breath. She suddenly understood why Lionel would disdain to be a bodyguard. Though Era had already seen through Lionel's potential, it seemed that even her own evaluation was too low. Someone with such an ability wouldn't be restricted by anything. Of course, Era was technically incorrect but also could be considered to be correct in a way as well. Without his ability, it would truly be impossible for Lionel to do what he was doing now. If this is truly the case, we have picked up a treasure. But this treasure will be difficult to control. Mistress Era regained her calm. No matter how one looked, it had become impossible to read her thoughts from her expression. So that's how things are. Lionel realized several things through countless experiments. For one, it was far more efficient to split his mind and meditate on the same spear. From Lionel's trials, for a spear at the bottom of the hill, it took about a single minute to master while meditating on the natural force art. For one nearer the middle, it took about 5 minutes. For one near the top, it took upwards of 10 minutes. However, if he meditated on a spear with 2 minds at once, the time was lowered by a factor of 3. A lower-tier spear would take 20 seconds and so on. The more minds Lionel used, the efficiency became greater and greater. Eventually, when he used all 8 minds, it took him no more than a second or 2 for a lower-tier spear and not even a third of a minute for a higher-tier one. Still, even this wasn't the greatest realization Lionel had made. When he went back to the base of the spear peak in order to experiment with lower-tier spears, he realized that masteries could be separated into tiers. Lionel personally chose to split masteries into 2 tiers. One, the lower, was what he called shallow mastery, while the higher was named depth mastery by him. Shallow mastery was all Lionel had grasped until now. In order to evoke this mastery, he had to recall the memories and project the image of the spear consciousness outward. This was why whenever he battled with his spear, the images of the spear owners would pop up. However, when he reached depth mastery, this evocation was no longer necessary. It became ingrained into his very bones. In order to reach depth mastery, the requirement was 10 times the time. This meant for a lower-level spear it would take about 20 seconds. For a middle-level spear it would around 2 minutes. For a higher-tier spear, it would take around 4 to 5 minutes. But for Lionel this was well worth it because he realized that when he reached depth mastery, the stamina it took him to use his dreamscape battle sense plummeted. Chapter 352. Lionel lost track of the days, causing the ladies within the carriage to almost become worried. This wasn't because they were worried for Lionel, and it wasn't because they were worried about their own safety having to sleep in the same region as a man either. After all, with Mistress Era here, even if Lionel had evil thoughts, whether or not he'd be able to keep his life for more than a few seconds was the real question in such a situation. What they were really worried about was cleanliness. They were very much worried that Lionel would ruin things with his presence. And as though this wasn't bad enough, he hadn't moved in almost a week already. But as time passed, they began to realize something extraordinary. Despite not making any attempts to clean himself, Lionel actually didn't smell. In fact, he looked the exact same as he had when he began to meditate without a care in the world. Not only that, but he didn't even try to strike up a conversation with any one of them. It made sense for him to maintain distance from Era. After all, considering how much Sil's elder brother doted on his wife, he might very well kill Lionel just for being in her presence like this. But what about Ri and Sil? The two women began to feel that there was either something wrong with them or something wrong with Lionel. Oh? Lionel's eyes suddenly shot open. A piercing gaze seemed to tear through the air before him as the faint light of a spear shot into the void. Mistress Era didn't miss this subtle change. But before she needed to act, Lionel snuffed out the aura himself. Lionel sent his gaze out of the carriage window, finding an ever-looming city quickly approaching. But this city made the one he had landed in seem like a children's toy. Its walls were hundreds of meters tall, projecting an air of not only strength but also artistry. Lionel never thought that he'd be thinking such a thing about wall, but here he was. The walls were a gentle gold color accented by a strong crimson red. Depictions of valiant warriors and magical beasts were etched across its surface, projecting a three-dimensional landscape of war. Just staring at the images made Lionel feel as though the clanging of weapons and the roaring of beasts were reverberating in his mind. Yet he couldn't take his eyes off of it. He felt his blood boil, his eyes flickering on and off with a violet-red color that shrouded the carriage in an oppressive air. This feeling. It was the very same feeling he had the first time he faced an army of demons. Sil and Ri shivered, inching away from Lionel while lamenting that the massive carriage was still too small. Mistress Era's gaze trembled. She too felt her heart palpitate. She could tell that this was the first time Lionel was seeing these walls. Usually, it was impossible to become so immersed during a second or third attempt. In addition, most would miss the opportunity and look away after losing courage, not knowing they were leaving an opportunity of a lifetime behind. Era could have never expected that Lionel would not only keep looking, but he had even awoken from his meditation as though he had sensed it calling out to him. This has no business on a fourth-dimensional world. Lionel suddenly mumbled. The words were only meant for himself, but Era's eyes widened when she managed to grasp them. In the end she smiled lightly. Though she did, with her demeanor, it was no more than the slightest curl of her lip. Lionel, you are quite patient. All this time you haven't asked what it is you'll be participating in. Lionel blinked out of his thoughts and looked toward the future matriarch of the Kiafer family. This was the first time she had spoken with him since he entered this carriage. I figured you'd tell me when it was time. Lionel finally replied. Era's beautiful blue eyes fluttered. Then, without responding directly to the question, she looked toward the city in the distance. Do you know what that city represents? Bravery, Lionel said without hesitation. Era seemed surprised by this answer before she smiled lightly. This time, her smile seemed much more obvious than it had been in the past. That's one answer, she said non-committedly. My answer, though, is even simpler than that. It's survival. Lionel's heart stilled for a moment. A flood of unknowable emotions surged through him, causing his blood to rumble once more. You say bravery because you have the strength to say as much. To those without power, it's never about something so idealistic. All they want to see is their next day, their next meal, their next breath. It's not about anything more than that. Sil's eyes glittered as she looked toward Lionel. Is this boy really powerful enough to gain such an evaluation from her sister-in-law? As for the simplest among them all, Ri, she almost couldn't refrain from harumphing. She clearly didn't like anything that praised Lionel. What powerful man would bully a young beautiful girl like her? More pointedly, what powerful man would have such a slave brand? Lionel didn't respond to these words. This wasn't the first time he had run into such a problem. His talk with Roaring Black Lion all those months ago still resurfaced in his memories from time to time. You could say that this is a matter of survival for our family. So, I hope that you'll treat this with the appropriate amount of seriousness. It was only now Lionel realized that he was dealing with a mad woman. This woman knew nothing about him. Yet, she directly snubbed a genius likely handpicked by their family in favor of him, a man branded with a mark that might as well have assigned him as a slave. If she wasn't mad, then how else would you describe it? Yet, Lionel couldn't help but find himself grinning. If he couldn't find Aina, the next best option was to raise holy hell until she caught wind of him being here. If this place was really so important, wouldn't it be perfect for him? He was beginning to think that Era might have taken a liking to him because he too was a madman. Chapter 353. That's the Kefir family's entourage. The outside of the valiant city was bustling. It was not much different from the people of Earth meeting their celebrities. To the common folk, a family that ruled of a city like Kefir's was far beyond their reach. To see them in the flesh like this was an opportunity of a lifetime. These people knew that they would never have the chance to enter Brave City. But they still traveled here from all over just to catch a glimpse of the festivities. The best part was that they could do so safely. No beasts or invalids would dare to enter even the 10-kilometer radius of Brave City. The aura around it was simply too oppressive. Thanks to this, it was often even safer to be here than it would be to stay at their homes. The Swan family escort is here. The crowd boiled once again. What could excite the people more if not rivalry and competition? Not only were the Swan and Kefir families both long-standing enemies, but they also both had the strength to stand out amidst the crowd. Terrain had a system of cities and powers. They worked together to balance one another. While the cities were ruled by city lords, the powers were ruled by patriarchs and matriarchs. Of course, there were divisions amongst cities and within powers. But both Kefir and Swan City were both the highest Tier 9 cities. They stood at the helm of the world along with the strongest powers. If not, they would never have teleportation hubs. The warriors of the Swan and Kefir families swept glances over one another, a haughty air exuding from them all. They seemed to toe a line of acknowledgement and indifference. Both entourages came to a stop about half a kilometer from the looming city gates. Even as members of the escort, they were aware that they wouldn't be allowed to enter the city gates. Only the elites amongst the elite would be allowed to do such a thing. At that moment, the crowd became entirely focused on the carriages near the middle of the entourage and the small group of elites around it. They all knew that the group of young men and women around the center and the elites within the carriage were the only ones that would be able to take the stage. At that moment, Zyler's expression was gloomy as could be. He gripped the reins of his war horse so tightly that the imprint seeped into his skin and even became soaked with blood. Those who had gained a quota along with Zyler looked toward him with pitying gazes and couldn't help but push their hatred for Lionel up another notch. This adulation should have been Zyler's. Yet, he wouldn't even get to participate in something he had worked so hard for. How could he also not be enraged? But, in a world where power spoke over all, there was nothing he could do. Mistress Era was more powerful than he was, so her word was final. Nothing more, nothing less. At that moment, the door to the Swan family's carriage opened. The first to step out was a young woman. Her demeanor and elegance was a step below that of Mistress Era. However, her looks were not in the least bit inferior. Her charm lay in her openness. She wore a modest blue dress that matched well with her deep black hair and fair complexion. A perpetual, inviting smile hung from her lips, capturing the hearts of all those who saw her. The moment this young woman stepped out, 8 youths riding war horses of their own stepped down from them, following to her back in an orderly fashion. Young Miss Swan, the crowd seemed to be breathless for a moment. Just as the atmosphere was reaching its peak, the Kefir family carriage opened. Syl descended with a bright smile. She didn't look directly at the crowd, but it still felt as though she had greeted them all one by one. She was nothing like the flustered young lady who didn't know how to respond to Lionel's bluntness and played every bit the part of elegant noble woman. Her charisma was no less than young Miss Swan. In fact, since she picked up some tips from her own sister-in-law, her own demeanor was even slightly more refined than the latter. However, it was at that instant that something no one could have possibly expected to happen occurred. Another person stepped out from the carriage, but his appearance came with what sounded like the shattering of countless hearts. The moment the young man appeared, it was as though a spear had suddenly been brandished before the world. A sharpening blade resonated in the ears of all those who saw him, causing the air to grow several times heavier. The young man's almost golden hair swayed gently beneath his billowing aura, a faint violet hue collecting around him like a cloud. It felt as though his immediate surroundings had become his inescapable domain, a place he controlled all to his own. For those moments he overshadowed Syl completely. Thoughts that he wasn't worthy to stand by her side didn't even have a chance to manifest before they were ruthlessly crushed. It was to the point that no one even noticed the black brand between his brows. At that moment, let alone those watching on, even Syl was stunned. Was this the same young man who had sat quietly within their carriage for so long? The same young man who had entered their city in rags? The legs of the war horses around Lionel trembled, causing some of the riders to almost fall off completely. Zemo's eyes narrowed. At that moment, he admonished himself for ever doubting the judgment of the mistress. Lionel swept a gaze over the crowd. He knew that in order to catch Aina's attention, he had to stand out as much as possible. He no longer bothered to restrain his aura, nor did he feign his usual modesty. Since he was here, he would make sure his name resounded throughout Terrain. At that moment, even the elegant young Miss Swan couldn't help but look toward him with a hint of shock and curiosity in her eyes. Then, she swept a glance toward Syl with a teasing expression. Within the carriage, Era was holding back a pouting Ri who was clearly dissatisfied by the fact she wasn't allowed to go. "Sister-in-law, I want to go too." Era shook her head. "You can enter the spectator stands with me later. You won't be able to enter the gates the normal way regardless." Though Era spoke these words to appease Ri, it was clear that she was absent-minded. Her gaze glistened as she watched Lionel's back through the curtains of the carriage. She felt that this was the true Lionel. But if that was the case, it'd be even more difficult to control than she thought. Still, he was a bit too naive. Regardless of what reasons he had for showing off his sharpness now, he was already being slowly ensnared by her. Looking toward her little sister-in-law's blushing face as she gazed toward Lionel who had suddenly appeared to her side, Era's slight smile appeared once again. Chapter 354. Lionel's aura blazed like the sun. Somehow, even with a beauty like Syl standing by him, she was the one who was overshadowed. "Who is that?" The crowd had fallen into a temporary silence before they suddenly erupted with discussion. "Am I seeing things? Did the Kefir family marry my goddess away?" In the minds of those on Terrain, the only reason a male could be sharing a carriage like this with the younger sister of the Kefir family heir could only be this. These big families cared too much about their reputation to allow even an inkling of rumors to start without adequate cause. This meant that even if these two weren't betrothed now, it wouldn't be long before they were. Of all those here, Syl seemed to be the one who understood this the most clearly, especially after she realized her sister-in-law was actually blocking Ri from exiting the carriage. Even if Ri's appearance wouldn't completely quell the rumors, it would at least calm some of the heat she was feeling now. Lionel, however, seemed oblivious to all of this. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the youths who had descended from their war horses. He could easily sense the hostility in their eyes. But, surprisingly, Xyler, who should feel the most wronged, was silent and refused to meet his eyes. "I can tell that you all are unsatisfied." Syl blinked, not expecting Lionel to be so direct. The version of Lionel she knew was closed off and restrained. She had no idea that this wasn't the real Lionel. Lionel wasn't a cold or arrogant person. He liked to think of himself as social and lively. But circumstances seemed to constantly be pushing his true self away. Hearing Lionel's words as though they held some compelling spell to them, the youths who were glaring at him still couldn't help but listen. "And though I know you all don't want to hear it, I'm sure you also understand that it wasn't my choice to be here either, right?" Xyler clenched his fists. "Hey, watch your words." A petite young woman stepped toward Lionel. Clearly she didn't like Lionel's words. What worse thing was there to hear after losing something that the person who got it didn't even appreciate it? In some ways that felt worse than said person just gloating. That said, how could Lionel not understand this? He swept a glance toward the petite young woman, causing her next words to get caught in her throat. For whatever reason, beneath Lionel's direct gaze, she couldn't seem to muster up any courage to continue her tirade. "I don't say this to belittle Xyler, I say this so that we can get an understanding of one another. Those were simply my feelings in the past. Now that I've seen those city gates and laid eyes on the war scenes it depicts." Lionel's hair billowed beneath his aura, his eyes blazing like two torches. He couldn't help but grin, the rushing of his blood sounding like crashing waterfalls in his ears. "I have not a single intention of giving my spot up." Lionel's almost fiendish grin caused the petite woman to stumble. "You seven and Syl are my teammates. I hope that instead of letting animosity get the best of you, you'll realize that sabotaging me is the very same as disrespecting Xyler." The young woman and the others were stunned. That was right, if they could get enraged simply because Lionel said that he didn't want the position to begin with, how much worse would it be to ruin the opportunity he had? Suddenly, the petite young woman felt as though she had fallen into a trap she couldn't get out of. Lionel smiled. "Let's go." Lionel turned toward the gates. Despite the fact they were half a kilometer away, it felt as though they were bearing down on him. This level of majesty was far beyond anything he had seen in his lifetime before. Syl and the others subconsciously followed his steps, not realizing their actions until Lionel suddenly stopped and looked back toward Xyler. Xyler stood with his fists clenched, looking toward their backs as blood trickled between his fingers. He was the first person to not avoid Lionel's gaze when he met them. Second place was never an option for me, Lionel said plainly. At first, it sounded as though Lionel was leaving behind some scolding words for Zyler. However, what Zyler heard was completely different. What he heard was a promise. Syl blinked, not really believing what she was seeing. How did he rein in these arrogant geniuses? Even she could hardly do it, and that was only because of her family background, while the other half of the reason was because they wanted to marry her. Plus, how did she suddenly become a background character? Before she could realize what was happening, their group had caught up to the Swan families. Lionel stood at the helm with Syl by his side. Young Miss Swan stood at the forefront of her own group, looking toward them curiously. All of them stood at the demarcation line. Those without talent didn't dare to cross this 500-meter mark from the brave city gates. If they dared to do so, they would only be asking for death. Young Miss Swan blinked. "Is this your man, little Syl?" "He's quite good. I'm a little bit jealous." Lionel pretended as though he hadn't heard anything, but Syl suddenly became flushed. The men within young Miss Swan's group stared daggers toward Lionel. It seemed they didn't quite like that their goddess was praising another man. A particular large one amongst them, standing a head taller than even the already tall Lionel, shot an aura of competition toward him. Lionel planned to ignore this and take the first step forward. However, it was then that a rush surged through the crowd once again. It seemed that another city lord power had appeared. Chapter 355. The Black City Escort. This city seemed to take their name quite seriously. Their war steeds were a deep shade of night with a singular jagged horn gracing their foreheads. Their carriage seemed carved of carbon, and an oppressive aura hung over them all. Bang! The carriage doors opened. The first thing anyone saw was a heavily armored leg smashing against the ground. Lionel could tell that if it wasn't for the fact this was a fourth-dimensional world, the ground would have been cracked beyond repair. But even then, the weight of this man was undeniable. And when he came into view, his oppressive presence seemed to overshadow all things. The man's beard could only be described as furious. It ran across his face and jaw like the blades of a knife. It was objectively unkempt. But if the man groomed it, something would feel off, as though this was his natural state. The state of the man's face made it hard to tell his age. But those with sharp senses could tell that he was also a youth. His heavy black armor clinked about as he walked. Without having to say a word, 8 followed him in tow, soon reaching the demarcation line as well. At that moment, the young man grinned, seeing the two beauties. Lucky, lucky. I was assigned to the same entrance as two beauties. Syl and young Miss Swan looked toward this young man with a hint of disgust and trepidation in their eyes. It was clear to them that Lionel was far more pleasing to the eye, especially since, other than his odd beard, this young man's head reflected the sun about as well as a polished mirror. That said, considering his status, his bald head had never gotten in his way of wooing women. So why would he care? At that moment, the little mink around Lionel's shoulders snickered. It seemed that many had missed its presence, just like many hadn't noticed the brand between Lionel's brows. When the man heard this, it looked toward Lionel and found the little mink, causing his eyes to glow. He could sense something he deeply liked within the body of this little mink. "I want your beast," he suddenly said. The little mink hopped to Lionel's head, wrapping around itself and yawning. The appearance of its little pink tongue made it seem as though it wasn't worried about the black-armored, bald man at all. Lionel swept a glance toward the black-armored man. There was a reason he had waited here, and it definitely wasn't out of respect for this man. Achievements were only worth something if others didn't achieve. There would be no happiness if there was no sadness, no joy if there was no despair. The more people there were to act as a contrast to him, the better. The black-armored man could tell that despite the fact Lionel had to look up, he wasn't oppressed by his aura in the slightest. However, unlike everyone else who had been starstruck by Lionel's appearance, the black-armored man was likewise not. "Life's unfair," Lionel said plainly. "Unfortunately, you can't always have what you want." Hearing Lionel's words, the young man was stunned for a moment before suddenly grinning fiendishly. "Slave brand. Third dimension. Little pretty gigolo. I never thought that someone like this would actually dare to speak to me in this way." The man's words were like a bomb going off in the crowd. Everyone had been so overwhelmed by Lionel's presence that they hardly dared to observe him closely. It was only after hearing these things that they suddenly realized that the black-armored man was correct. Lionel's lip curled, but the smile held a hint of coldness to it. He actually didn't mind the man saying such words. Sometimes infamy was the best form of fame. However, Lionel still marked this man as one that needed to be taught a lesson. Now he just had the perfect excuse to do so. Seeing Lionel's unperturbed smile, the black-armored man felt some discomfort. "It seems we have something in common," Lionel said lightly. "Before, no one dared to speak to me in this way either. It was only after the world began to change that some gained an overinflated sense of self-importance. It seems like you're another one of them. How about we make a bet?" The smile within Lionel's gaze deepened. "I don't have any words as pointed as gigolo to call you, but what do you say, Baldy?" The man's gaze narrowed as a silence fell over the crowd. "It seems you want to die." His voice became like gravel as his aura bore down on Lionel. "Do you accept or not, Baldy?" Lionel replied. The man stared toward Lionel before bursting out into a fit of laughter. When he finally stopped, his aura had become as heavy as a mountain, bearing down on everyone present. Whether it was his love of women or his want for the little mink, he forgot about them all in that very instant. "What is this bet? If the stakes are too small, I just might take your life right here and now. Isn't there a trial right before us now?" Lionel said plainly. "It'll not only outperform you, it'll embarrass you. As for the stakes, do you dare to bet your life?" Maybe it was because the valiant aura of the brave city gates was fueling his raging blood. Or maybe it was because Lionel was going all out to stand out as much as possible. But whatever the truth was, a bloodthirsty and cold presence seemed to exude from him. The man faltered slightly. Then he seemed to truly see Lionel for the first time. "I, Jeffrak Black, have never stepped down from any challenge." "Good," Lionel replied plainly. Lionel took a step forward and crossed the line. As though a beast was roaring in his face, his hair whipped back violently, his face even distorting slightly. "Since you've reported your name, I'll do the same. I'm Lionel Morales. Remember it well." Chapter 356. So panicked. The first reason was Lionel's crazy challenge and the second reason was the little mink. Lionel was still in the third dimension while Jeffrak had long since entered the fourth. On top of that, there was no way the little mink could withstand the pressure of Brave City. She had been so distracted before that she hadn't remembered the little beast until Jeffrak mentioned it. Now that she had, she couldn't help but close her eyes, not wanting to watch such an innocent little beast die like this. However, even with her eyes closed and several seconds ticking by, the sound she expected to hear never reached her ears. Everyone watched in shock as Lionel took one step after another. It seemed as though the pressure couldn't do much more to him than kick up a strong wind. As for the little mink, it growled a bit. But afterward, its body exuded a slight black fog. Soon it was sleeping again as though nothing had happened. At that moment, Lionel turned back toward their group. "Aren't you all coming?" Lionel asked. With that, Lionel continued forward. In his sights, the looming walls bore down on him as though trying to crush his will. Syl grit her teeth and took a step forward as well. The instant she did, she felt her knees buckle for a moment before they straightened. As though her actions were a cue, the youths began to move as one, their actions the subject of great entertainment for the surrounding crowd that didn't dare to follow. Jeffrak, too, took a heavy step forward, plowing through the pressure until he matched up to Lionel's speed. His gaze didn't leave Lionel's side profile as though he was waiting for the latter to collapse. Since he had accepted the bet, he wouldn't attack Lionel now. However, the moment Lionel showed any signs of collapsing, he would strike him dead. No one, not even his own brothers, would dare to talk to him in the way Lionel had. And this arrogant prick actually dared to report his name right after his? He really wanted to see how far a third-dimensional ant could go. At that moment, across the 8 gates of Brave City, similar competitions were happening all over. The fervor of the crowds in these locations were no less. However, the location of the Swan, Kiafur and Black families was still among the most heated. How could it not be if a bet to the death was taking place? However, the quick conclusion many were expecting never came. Lionel's steps remained steady. In fact, it seemed as though he had forgotten all about the world around him. He continued to stare intently at the gates before him, the images of battle being firmly ingrained into his mind. He lost himself in his focus, causing a familiar aura to billow out from around him. Jeffrak felt his heart seize when he felt it. To a genius like him, making it to the gates was an easy task. He was leisurely strolling just like Lionel was. They both knew that the true distinguishing factors would only make themselves known at the gates themselves. However, feeling such an aura, Jeffrak's steps faltered. He even felt that the pressure coming from Lionel was a step more forceful than even the Brave City gates. Soon the group separated. In the very front there was Lionel and Jeffrak. A step behind them were young Miss Swan and Syl. And, much further behind them were the petite young woman and the other lackeys of the city lord Powers. Who is he? Young Miss Swan looked toward Syl with curious, blinking eyes. A delicate sweat covered her elegant brow. But rather than destroying her demeanor, it made her look more pitiable. She played the role of vulnerable princess in need of saving exceptionally well. It was clear that the two women could be walking side by side with Lionel and Jeffrak should they want to. However, there was no need to enter a big dick contest between men. Whether they reached the gates first or last, it wouldn't make much of a difference as long as they did so within the allotted time. Realizing this, why would young Miss Swan not take the opportunity to learn a bit more about this mysterious Lionel character? Syl blinked innocently, a beautiful smile crossing her soft pink lips. None of your business. The two women walked side by side, smiling amicably. Yet the atmosphere was deathly cold. Maybe this was the hypocrisy of women. They too were having their own big dick contest, it was just more covert. At that moment, Jeffrak was still observing Lionel. Maybe due to the influence of the brave city gates, but he was the only one who could sense this oppressive aura coming from Lionel. He seemed to realize this as well, judging by the reactions of everyone else, so he bit down hard on his tongue so as not to lose face. However, Lionel couldn't be bothered to deal with him. A huge chunk of herb or suddenly appeared in his hand. This pressure makes it easier to absorb the herb essence. Thanks to his breakthrough, Lionel was already within the superior stage. At this level, his body was already comparable to a weak pseudo-fourth dimension metal and he was only a stage away from perfection. Disregard, Lionel had already gotten his use out of Jeffrak. What happened from here on out between them didn't matter to him as long as he beat him. Jeffrak seemed to sense this as well and it lit a fire in his chest. However, no amount of his anger seemed to change a single thing. For entities as strong as them, it should have only taken less than a minute to cross 500 meters. Yet, under the pressure it took them a half hour. When the gates became clear, everyone seemed to understand that this was where the true trial began. The doors loomed to an impossibly tall height. Standing beneath them, Lionel could only lift his head vertically. And even then it was hard to see the tops of the walls. However, it was these very doors they needed to push to enter. Chapter 357. Jeffrak was drenched in sweat. In order not to lose face, he had kept up with Lionel's pace from start to finish. But the result made his lungs scream. Unfortunately, the pressure of the gates had nothing to do with strength. Even a fifth-dimensional entity would face a proportional amount of pressure. This was, of course, the same for Jeffrak. But what Jeffrak couldn't believe was that Lionel seemed unaffected. Let alone breathing as heavily as him, Lionel didn't even seem as though he had sweated a single drop. To make matters worse, Jeffrak was certain that the reason he was in such a sorry state was because of the pressure of the wall, but rather because of the pressure from Lionel himself. Finally, for the first time since their competition began, Lionel looked toward Jeffrak. You don't look too good, Baldy. You doing okay? Jeffrak's gaze flashed with a bloody red. He glared at Lionel, his chest heaving. At that moment, from atop the city walls, a few individuals looked down with curiosity. They all seemed like youths as well. However, whether they had gone through the same trials or not was unknown. Isn't that Black City's bald boy? He looks like he's in a pretty sorry state. What happened to him? The few on the wall chuckled. However, let alone hearing them, those below couldn't even see them. It was as though they were in a completely different world. The only one who frowned, seemingly realizing something was off, was Lionel. However, even with his senses, he had no way of seeing through the Brave City barrier. He only felt a faint itching at the small of his back as though he was being watched. Which door do you think they'll be able to open? PFT, aren't you just wondering if we'll have any competition? Regardless, if they're anything below Royal, it'll be too much of a disappointment. If that was the case, I would have gotten up to come all the way over here for no reason. If you wanted to watch true elites, you should have gone to watch the gates with Powers rather than this City Lord gate. It's rare for anything meaningful to come out of the cities. And those that are worth watching have already entered the city. Well, isn't that madman's sister down there? Maybe the genes run in the Kiefer family. The others looked at the young man who spoke like he was crazy. You know that madman is overprotective about anything related to his wife and his little sister. You better watch your mouth. I don't care if you die, but if I'm guilty by association, who will I go complain to? It was clear that these people were speaking about Syl's elder brother. It seemed that he had already entered the city. However, oddly enough, his wife and Syl's sister-in-law, Era, didn't seem to be a participant. It obviously wasn't because Era was too weak, and it obviously wasn't because she was too old. Whatever the true reason behind this was, seemed a bit complicated. Regardless, Lionel wasn't privy to this information, as he couldn't even hear the conversation. Still, all those on the top of the city walls seemed to accept this person's word as law, and they all closed their mouths. It's a shame though. Someone else picked up the conversation that had fallen to silence. The cities are only going to fall further and further behind the powers at this rate. If they don't get themselves together and see the bigger picture, they'll be left behind. The others sneered hearing this. It was clear they were all from powers themselves, or they wouldn't be reacting like this. It isn't their fault. Their structures are flawed from the beginning. Us powers are built on strength first and foremost, while their foundations are economy and governance. To them, abandoning terrain would ruin their futures completely, whereas for us, wherever there's room for self-improvement, we'll be able to thrive. They only have themselves to blame for their collapse. The words these young masters spoke easily uncovered the dark underbelly of terrain without regard. Unlike the common people who had to tiptoe around their words, these nobles spoke their minds freely and boldly. This was the representation of true power. The group snickered. Oh, looks like someone is going to try? Is that boy really in the third dimension? They had been so lost in their own worlds that it was only now they noticed that the young man teaching Jirak his place was actually within the third dimension. For one, they had never heard of a person in the third dimension even making it through the pressure of the gates. Though the pressure was adjusted based on strength, there was still a minimum requirement for foundation. They had simply never seen someone within the third dimension meet these standards. And, secondly, anyone who could make a fool out of Jirak should definitely be a monster. The only reason they hadn't paid more attention to Lionel before despite this was because the city lord system was declining harshly. Though Jirak had some fame, they all docked him several points simply by virtue of this. Why would they care about someone who was only beating someone they didn't care much about to begin with? Would you care about the power of someone capable of stomping an ant to death? Bang. At that moment, Lionel's palm touched the tall doors, his robes and hair billowing. Jirak, who was already hardly able to stand on his own 2 feet, was blasted flying, rolling in the dirt until he slowly landed before the feet of the 2 women who were still a good distance from the gates. Lionel felt a force trying to rip his arm apart. Strong energy surged toward him, but they rebounded off his body like crossing blades, filling the air with the sound of harsh sharpening metal. Bang! The ground beneath Lionel's feet cracked slightly. Fine lines raced across, meeting together and separating just as quickly as they spread outward. Lionel closed his eyes. He could sense the 5 levels of the door. In fact, it wasn't much different from the scene he saw when unlocking his metal synergy lineage factor. Soldier, General, Royal, King, Emperor. The whole city quaked. Lionel thought of waiting for Jirak to go first again. But after seeing his poor performance, Lionel felt that it was beneath him to even need such a person to contrast himself with. He simply served no purpose. In that case, he would make it a one-man show. His singular palm rested the door. He could feel it pushing back against him, wanting to throw him away the very same way Jirak had been. Lionel's eyes shot open. Bronze runes raced across his body, a halo of bronze violet appearing above his head. Those with lineage factors suddenly felt their hearts tremble, their blood running in reverse. Open. Bang. The scene was one those watching would never forget. Chapter 358. Bang. Bang. The gates flew open. In those moments, it felt as though a tornado had formed around Lionel. On one side, wind rushed in violently, blowing everything away. On the other, an undefeatable suction surged, sweeping up everything in a rush of quicksand-like wind. However, nothing was as deafening as the sound of the gates smashing against the hallowed walls of Brave City. The reverberation was so resounding, so cacophonic, so tempestuous that the whole city quaked. At that moment, no matter what section of the city you were in, everyone looked toward the same direction, shock coloring their features. This commotion? What could it possibly be? Those that could see what was happening were shocked to the point of speechlessness. The crowd that had been spectating from half a kilometer away only saw Lionel place a single palm forward before doors that towered into the skies nearly flew off their hinges beneath his presence. In fact, the ground beneath their feet quaked endlessly, causing some weaker individuals to fall to their butts, unable to understand what they had just seen. Just what level of strength was this? Of course, these people had no idea that opening the doors wasn't a contest of strength, it was a contest of will and battle aura. However, to Lionel, who had already fully awakened the first level of his metal synergy lineage factor, it was nothing but a joke. In fact, Lionel even felt it was too easy. Soldier, general, royal, king and emperor? Lionel thought to himself, looking into the massive window toward the city he had created himself. Something seems to be missing. Lionel took a step forward, crossing the threshold. A wash of energy flooded toward him, coalescing into a golden brand between his brows. Compared to the runes that shone across his body, it was lacking in momentum and radiance. However, to those of Brave City, this golden mark was the highest entry honor of the city, the Emperor class. Lionel had no idea the level of commotion his actions would cause. Brave City was separated into tiers. Much like some parts of society, there were locations one could not enter without the appropriate credentials or standing. Within the city, these separating lines were even more exaggerated. The city itself isn't like how one would think it would be. Rather than being a metropolis, Brave City looked more like a war camp. There were no paved roads. Just like the outside of the city walls, the ground was covered in nothing but a brownish soil that looked like the land of a military practice ground. In every which direction one could find monuments of stone called the Bravery Pillars. They depicted the exploits of soldiers and generals of the past and were among the most important staples of Brave City. Rather than buildings, much of Brave City was an arrangement of tents, especially the outer city limits. Only royals were allowed to live in small hut-like structures while only emperors had stone housing for themselves. However, despite this seemingly organized structure, there was nothing peaceful about this city. Battles of all sorts seemed to take place every moment. Whether it was a battle for resources, for the monuments or even for housing, it seemed as though one would take place all the time. Outside of the seemingly territorial housing system, there didn't seem to be a single ounce of order throughout the whole city. Except for in just one place. A singular tower stood in the very middle of the city. Aside from the walls of the city itself, it was the only structure that stood above 2 or 3 stories tall. In fact, it shot hundreds of meters into the air much like the war-etched walls on the outside. From the top of this tower, one could overlook the whole city and all 8 of its gates. However, to be able to step to this floor, the minimum requirement was to be a king. For someone of such standing, they obviously wouldn't come here to overlook ants they thought to be beneath them. That said, there were exceptions to every rule. Just how much commotion would the swinging of doors hundreds of meters high cause? Just how much worse would this commotion be if the action was so violent that the doors hardly stopped even after slamming into the walls that held it up? Everyone knew that for the whole gate to open, it could only mean that a new emperor had appeared. However, even past emperors hadn't caused such a commotion and most people could only hurriedly squeeze through a crack they caused in the gates. Who had ever heard of someone being given such a wide berth? At that moment, the usually bustling top tower floor fell into silence. Their eyes all landed on the same young man. Compared to the size of the doors, he seemed so small, like an ant that could be stamped into a meat paste at any moment. However, it was as though the doors didn't dare to close as he walked through. They stayed attached to the walls, still reverberating with residue of the previous impact that even to this moment, resounded in everyone's ears like an endless echo. Who was that? They were all stunned to find out that none of them recognized the young man. Other than feeling some trembling in their hearts toward the odds runes drawn across his body, there was nothing else they could glean about him. It seemed that a variable had appeared. Within the tower, 3 familiar faces could be found. Well, they weren't quite familiar to Lionel. However, had Aina been there, there would be no doubt that she would recognize these people at first glance. Young heir of Cliff's Edge Terrace, Rainred Solar. Young heiress to World's End Falls, Jilnia Falls. Young heir to Mirage Pavilion, Wheeless Mirage. These 4 people had no idea how they were connected, but it didn't seem to matter. Brave City would make them enemies regardless. At that moment, as though everyone had realized a singular threat before them, several auras locked onto Lionel. Chapter 359. Bang. A shadowy figure shot through the roof of an inn, causing brick and chips of wood to fly through the air. The shocked screams of the citizens rocked the small city, but the shadowy figure continued to leap from wall to wall and house to house, eventually landing atop the city walls. These walls couldn't compare to those of Brave City in the slightest. They were at most 10 meters tall and a few meters thick. This place was only considered a Tier 7 city that couldn't compare even to Swan, Black or Kiafur City. However, it was unique in that rather than being under the jurisdiction of a city lord power, it was beneath the power of World's End Falls. When the shadowy figure finally came to a stop, those that could see it shivered. The figure was completely covered in a black cloak. Its back hunched up in a curved arc, making it difficult to tell just how someone with a body like this could possibly move so agilely. The figure held a massive great sword in their hands that spanned the length of 3 meters. Even now, it glistened with the blood of several guards. At that moment, the city guards charged from all directions wearing white robes alternating in a sky blue soft armor. Sword monstress. The cloak covering the face of the sword monstress blew off, revealing the figure's features. It took but a moment for them all to recognize this scourge of terrain. She could only be described as a grotesque woman. She had a hunched back, her hair was unkempt and wild, and her face made the stomachs of all those who saw her crawl. They had long since lost count of the number of massacres this beast had been the cause of. She had wanted posters almost everywhere, yet she somehow managed to vanish whenever they seemed close to catching her. The sword monstress gaze looked particularly demonic. As though she had lost all sense of human reason, she all but growled in response. Without a word, she leapt forward, her monstrous sword being raised in her claw-like hands. The guard who had spoken found his vision splitting in two. Before he could even react, his consciousness faded, his body falling to the ground in 2 halves. The sword monstrous body flashed, her sword drawing lines of crimson throughout the streets. Blood flowed to the stone-paved ground, seeping through the cracks and dyeing them red. Each life she reaped was only met by a violent gaze that only seemed to grow more and more bloodthirsty. It was as though it wasn't enough, as though she wanted more. At that moment, the head guard of the Tier 7 city had finally gotten word of what was happening and began to rush over. The sword monstress, seemingly realizing the incoming danger, suddenly stopped her endless slaughter. She looked toward the distance, 2 sharp teeth shining through her heaving breath. Her body blurred, accelerating toward the distance. She leapt over the city wall as though it didn't exist, vanishing toward the wilderness before the head guard could long onto her. By the time the head guard appeared amidst the carnage, she had already long since left, leaving him standing there with a chest filled with rage and nothing to vent it on. Inform the higher-ups that she's escaped the encirclement by unknown means. Her next destination is unknown. The head guard clenched his fists. He already knew that his punishment for this wouldn't be small, but it was simply too difficult to lock onto a single target who hadn't been branded. With everyone headed toward Brave City, the in and out flux of tourists and citizens was too high. This was likely the worst time to be trying to catch a criminal. Lionel walked into the city. He swept his gaze over everything once before heading in deeper. Era hadn't told him much about the city and how things worked. All he knew was that entering was a test, and the better he performed, the greater benefits there was. Other than this, he also knew that when he chose an abode to stay in, he had to stay in this eastern section of the city since he entered through the eastern section. This wasn't to say that it was impossible to travel to other sections, but rather that it was seen as an act of war that could spark something he currently didn't have the means to deal with. Lionel, though, had his own reasons for being eager to enter the city. It wasn't just about making his name known so he could find Aina easier, it was also about finding a safe place to break through. Lionel felt like Brave City was the best place he could ever find to break through with his soul force. In fact, Lionel knew that he had no choice but to do this. If he didn't, he would have no way of dealing with the trials to come in the future. After claiming a home, you could receive a half-day's protection. But after that, Lionel knew that trouble would come knocking at his door. In truth, even if he broke through, Lionel wasn't quite confident in protecting himself. All of the spells he had, even the most powerful 3-star Magus arts, were still mere 3rd-dimensional spells. Lionel didn't know how useful they would be against 4th-dimensional existences. Knowing this, rather than going off to quickly find a house to claim, Lionel waited for Syl. He felt that this city would most definitely have opportunities for him to take advantage of. He would take his time to find them before taking advantage of the 12-hour protection he would receive. This was, of course, the best plan. Lionel's thoughts were meticulous and well thought out. It was just a shame that trouble would find him before he could act on it completely. Those youths that had just been standing atop the wall recovered from their shock and stabilized their feet, having almost fallen from the wall thanks to Lionel's entry. After sending a glance toward each other, one after another, they descended the walls. Soon, they stood on level ground along with Lionel as the heavy gates slammed shut. Bang. Chapter 360. Lionel swept a glance toward the group before him. Though there were just 4 of them, each had the marks of royals on their foreheads. Lionel still wasn't exactly sure what this system of ranking meant, but just by virtue of this he was aware of why these 4 had come. However, he wasn't worried. These 4 didn't have any ability to take his mark of an emperor until he chose a home and had held it in his possession for 12 hours. Since he hadn't even chosen a home yet, it was impossible for them to do so. That said, that didn't mean they couldn't act without reward, likely in an attempt to get him to hand over the mark himself. The 4 young men and women looked Lionel up and down with curiosity. "Who are you?" one of them suddenly asked. The speaker wore red robes matched with violet soft armor. Had Lionel been well informed, he would know that this young man came from Mirage Pavilion. However, considering his ignorance, other than noticing the well-matched colors, he didn't really think anything more of it. Lionel smiled carefreely. "My name is Lionel Morales." In Lionel's opinion, the more people who knew his name, the better. He didn't care about what tone the speaker was using, even if he was quite condescending. All that mattered to Lionel was that more people knew his name. The happenings of Terrain meant little to him, and he also didn't particularly care about what this brave city represented and the reason so many youths had come to this place. All he cared about was making his way back to Earth after finding Aina. If Lionel were to say what his goals were aside from finding her, it would only be destroying the Royal Blue Fort and helping Aina get revenge. Though he didn't know the full extent of Aina's backstory, knowing that the Brazinger family had wronged her was enough for him. Seeing Lionel's bright smile, the 4 were caught off guard. They had fully expected Lionel to lash out or even ignore them, giving them ample reason to stomp all over his pride. Though they asked who Lionel was, they already knew that he was a member of the Kiefer family. To them, other than Syl's elder brother, there was no one else worth fearing from this family. Even if Lionel was a bit more talented than their usual selection, so what? He was still within the 3rd dimension. Even the weakest individual knew how impossible it was to cross the dimensional barrier to battle, let alone doing so against 4 people. As far as they were concerned, Lionel was finished. However, as the saying went, it was hard to punch a smiling face. At that moment, the large doors were opened once again. However, this time, instead of the whole gate moving, it was simply one of the inner gates. And instead of it almost flying from its hinges as it had done just moments ago, barely a crack was formed for a tall, black-armored figure to squeeze through in a sorry state. It could only be said that the harsh reality of comparing yourself to another was too heart-wrenching. Jirak practically collapsed to the ground, heaving out such heavy breaths that it seemed he might cough up his lung at any moment. He placed his hands on his knees to keep himself from lying flat on the dusty roads. Unfortunately, he huffed up a big mouthful of kicked-up dirt, causing him to cough violently. He couldn't have been in a sorrier state, causing the 4 youths to snicker. When Jirak heard this, he looked up, his eyes reddening. "Who the fuck are you? You dare to laugh at me?" The youths wanted to laugh again, but Jirak suddenly vanished, appearing amidst the group and sending out a fist. The air shook beneath his strength, folding in on itself and layering his fists in a quaking wind. Lionel's lip twitched as he watched this. What kind of man with a wind affinity this high wears heavy army like that? At first glance he should be an earth affinity mage like me. Bang. The youth from the Mirage Pavilion was sent flying. Lionel could tell with a single glance that his jaw was snapped from its hinges. It was clear that whatever meals this youth would be having over the next few weeks would have to be through a straw. Who else? Who else was laughing it up? Come on, tell me. Where's the joke? I want to laugh too. It was impossible for anyone to tell that these 4 youths had just been standing atop the walls of the city, commenting on how weak Jirak was. Lionel watched in silence, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lip. This Jirak was an interesting character. Jirak's fist slammed into the second male, sending him tumbling toward the first. They piled atop of one another, groaning and without the strength to stand. "Get a room, you bunch of perverts." Jirak growled before looking toward the 2 women. "I don't hit girls." Before the 2 women could sigh a breath of relief, Jirak continued. "Smack each other until I'm satisfied." The 2 women looked at one another, then back at Jirak as though they were ready to fight to the death. But upon seeing Jirak rubbing his fists, their hearts trembled and they turned toward one another, each trying to get the first hit in. Jirak clapped, a wide grin spreading across his face. He brought his fingers to his mouth, whistling as though he was encouraging them to go on. "Go on, fight harder." "Yeah, just like that." "Hey, I bet she won't be able to fight as hard if you rip her clothes." "Whistle, what a show. What delicate skin. Oh, I think I see a little pink. Top tier, top tier." Jirak took out some herb coins and started flicking them toward the 2 fighting girls. He looked like he was having the time of his life. Lionel stood to the side, speechless. Chapter 361. Just when Jirak was getting into his groove, the gates opened once again, and this time 2 women entered. Of course, they were Syl and young Miss Swan. When the 2 women saw the scene before them, they charged toward Jirak like a twin pair of lionesses. In fact, they even sent glaring daggers toward Lionel for not stepping in to stop this madman earlier. Toward such a thing, Lionel only chuckled and didn't say much. He was going to step in previously, but since they were here now, he didn't have to do anything. All right. Since these 2 she-devils have stepped in for you, leave your panties behind and we can call it even. The 2 women shivered in terror hearing these words. Jirak. Syl snapped. All right. Forget it. Jirak shook his head as though it was truly a pity. Looking quite pitiable, the 2 women helped their 2 friends up and they stumbled away. It was only now they noticed that Jirak actually had a king mark on his forehead. It seemed that they had been so distracted by how terrible he looked before that they had forgotten to account for this. It was only after this that Jirak suddenly looked toward Lionel seriously. Do what you will. Jirak closed his eyes, crossing his arms across his chest and lifting his neck as though waiting for a blade to run across it. The little mink atop Lionel's head yawned lazily before sticking out its tongue as though to make fun of Jirak. It got bored of this quite quickly though and went back to its nap. Lionel could tell that the little guy was growing more languid lately. The little mink he knew was always lively and looking to play. Lionel wasn't sure if this change was it maturing or if there was another reason. That aside, Lionel wasn't thinking much about this right now. He was only quite surprised that Jirak actually seemed to be waiting for death. Of course, Lionel had never really expected to kill him in the first place. For one, he wasn't a bloodthirsty person and he didn't enjoy to kill unless it was absolutely necessary. And, secondly, he had only been saying the most boisterous things he could say for the sake of making sure his story spread as widely as possible. Lionel suddenly smiled. So your life is mine, right? Jirak opened his eyes and frowned. But in the end? Yes. Good. Lionel's smile widened. Follow me then. I also don't know enough about this place, so tell me about it. Jirak raised his brows, unclenching fists he hadn't known he had clenched. Isn't Syl your fiancée? She didn't tell you anything about this? Lionel made a weird face. Fiancée? No, she isn't. Syl suddenly flushed as red as a tomato. Do you believe I won't rip your tongue out, Jirak? Jirak blinked. So she's single? Jirak. Young Miss Swan giggled from the sidelines, seemingly enjoying this quite a bit. After a while, her eyes sparkled when she looked toward Lionel. So he's single too. Lionel, however, was no longer paying attention to their antics. His gaze seemed to cut through space, landing on a tower in the distance. From there, he could feel numerous gazes on him, all of which seemed to be waiting for something. Lionel felt his blood surging. Who knew how long it would take him to realize that his actions over the past few hours weren't as much of an act as he thought it was? You're saying no one knows where Brave City came from? Lionel looked toward Jirak, Syl and Kyra with a weird expression. Of course, Kyra was the first name of young Miss Swan. After listening to the banter between the 2 women, Lionel finally managed to learn this much. Well? Jirak mumbled. There are some theories, but... Well, the truth is that as a 4th-dimensional world, we don't have high enough standing to confirm or deny this. We only have a few rumors. Lionel could see the discomfort the 3 felt when Jirak said these words. It seemed that this wasn't something that was acknowledged often. But, in the grand scheme, it was nonetheless true that a 4th-dimensional world wasn't worth mentioning. It made Lionel realize that as small as terrain was, Earth was even more so. What rumors? Lionel asked. Jirak hesitated as though he wasn't sure whether or not he should say. But, maybe because he remembered Lionel owned his life now, he realized he had no choice. They say that brave cities only appear in worlds that are at a crossroad. Lionel frowned. What was that supposed to mean? A crossroad? What kind of crossroad? One where we either develop ourselves or choose to abandon everything our ancestors built. Lionel still wasn't sure if he understood what this meant, but seeing as the 3 were only growing more uncomfortable, he shifted his focus slightly. Then what does a brave city get out of appearing? Is it like a subdimensional zone? Not exactly. Zones are created by the dimensional verse. But brave cities are built by people. As for what they get out of it, they say it's recruitment. Lionel's brow raised. A world at a crossroad, built by people. It's all for recruitment? Lionel couldn't help but think of the Star and Cross organization. Even to this point he still didn't know their true name. All he had was a gut feeling that their scope was beyond that of just terrain and that their uniforms were cool. There was nothing else. But who knew that even before he could understand who they were, another mysterious organization would appear. In fact, this one's method seemed even more shocking than the first. The Star and Cross organization was still tangible to Lionel. He could see them, interact with them, and, unfortunately, be shamed by them. But this brave city organization had no face or image. And they somehow managed to make a city manifest from thin air without even the strongest powers of this world understanding how. For the first time, Lionel was starting to get an understanding that this new world order was anything but peaceful. Chapter 362. Lionel stood at the base of a large stone monument. Just looking at it, it exuded the same type of aura the city gates had. It was just that this aura was displayed on a much smaller scale. Rather than enveloping an area of half a kilometer, this aura acted on just the 10-meter radius of the monument. However, from what Lionel could tell, this aura was actually several times that of the gates, as though it had been concentrated in place. Many people who stood around the monument curiously observed the new group of 4. When they saw that it was made of 3 kings and an emperor, they grew shocked and began to whisper amongst each other. In this sort of place, information was the greatest strength. The fact that they didn't know that these people were among the kings and emperors meant that they could only be new. Lionel? Syl said hesitantly. We still need to go report to my elder brother. Lionel frowned. Report? He felt a strong feeling against doing something like this. There was no telling what kind of personality Syl's elder brother had or how he would react to Lionel's sudden appearance. Meet him later. Lionel nodded noncommittedly. Syl bit her lip, ignoring Kyra's amused gaze. This damn vixen. Is it necessary to stand so close to him? Still, Lionel didn't seem to notice the squabble between these two women, nor did he seem to realize that Syl's invitation was more about getting him away from young Miss Swan than anything else. But, whether he acknowledged it or not didn't matter much, he already had his own plan in mind. Explain these monuments to me one more time, Jirak. Jirak grumbled. Was he really nothing but a glorified dictionary? He had no idea that this really was the case. Lionel didn't want to expose the true capabilities of the dictionary, so he continued to use it only as a translation tool. He didn't feel like falling out with another organization that lusted after his treasures. All these monuments depict moments in history. There's nothing special about them other than the fact cultivation is a bit faster if you can withstand their aura. You can see it for yourself, it's just telling the tale of some dead general. Lionel nodded. Maybe it was because this brave city wasn't native to terrain, but the words on this monument could be understood by Lionel even without using the dictionary's help. Gained victory after 121 days of battle. Mounted the head of. The more Lionel read, the more useless the information seemed to become. It was almost like a newspaper article. All of the most important facts about the topic were found in the header and the first few paragraphs. As it continued, it got useless to the point of even describing what General Farron had for breakfast that morning. It was no wonder Jirak had said this monument was useless. Lionel had no interest in how many women a general bedded in celebration of his victory. However, no matter how Lionel looked at it, he didn't think that these monuments were so simple because he felt danger from them. His primitive senses made him feel as though if he played around with these monuments too long he could die. The weird part about this feeling was that, obviously, no had died at the hands of this monument before. Had someone died, there was no way everyone here would be so casual about it. In fact, the only slight conflict here was in decided who was allowed to enter the 10-meter radius of the monument. Of course, danger didn't necessarily mean that this monument would be avoided. After all, with danger came opportunities. But Jirak would have definitely mentioned it had such a danger existed. Lionel suddenly closed his eyes. A massive spherical force art was reflected in his mind. At that moment, his aura completely changed as though he had become one with nature. Even though he was standing right next to Kyra, Syl and Jirak, it was as though he was in an entirely different world. When he opened his eyes again and read the first line again, a shocking change occurred. Before Lionel could continue, his vision was enveloped in blackness. When his vision returned, what he saw was no longer a monument. He saw a man wearing a fiery red armor. He sat upon a tall crimson steed and held a halberd that was just as blood red. The aura he exuded was so suffocating that Lionel nearly fell to his knees. At that moment, the man riding the crimson steed stood at the helm of a massive army. He was leading so many men that from afar, they looked like millions of little ants arranged into neat square formations. Yet, despite the number of men, this man stood valiantly, his presence alone subduing the whole of the army. The man leveled his halberd with the ground, his chest growing out a size as he took a deep breath. The moment he released his breath, a mighty roar that shook the skies bore itself into Lionel's heart. Bang! Lionel was sent flying. Blood leaked from his nose and ears, his body skidding along the dirt roads. A violent force tore through his mind, looking to tear his ethereal glabella to shreds. It was as though this force wanted to erase any memories Lionel might have just gained. Lionel. Jirak and the two women were shocked, not knowing what happened. They all looked around with frantic gazes as though trying to find who sneak attacked Lionel. That seemed to be the only explanation for what just happened. Unable to find a thing, they could only rush to his side. But Lionel was out cold, blood continuing to flow from his orifices as a violent energy continued to rampage through his mind. Chapter 363. Lionel. Lionel. No matter how they shouted Lionel's name, it didn't seem to matter in the slightest. The one who attacked him must have wanted him dead, there was no other explanation. The appearance of a third-dimensional emperor was too conspicuous. The number who wanted to take advantage of Lionel's weakness was likely not few. It was simply too easy for those fourth-dimensional monsters to kill Lionel secretly without any of them being any wiser. It couldn't be said that these three would live and die with Lionel. How could they? They had only just met. Jirak was practically Lionel's slave now, while the two women only had a small bit of budding feelings. It wasn't to the point of risking their lives. Yet all three of them still uncontrollably ran to Lionel's side when they saw his current state. It was clear they all had a good impression of him. The little mink scrambled from Lionel's head, landing on his face and nudging him continuously. The energy continued to rampage throughout Lionel's mind. But it seemed to notice that it couldn't shatter the barriers of Lionel's ethereal glabella after a few attempts. How could it? After awakening his wisdom branch, Lionel's mind had already become capable of housing fifth-dimensional soul force. Even though he had yet to come in contact with fifth-dimensional force, it didn't change this fact. When comparing the sturdiness of one's ethereal glabella, Lionel was unmatched on terrain and earth. Seemingly realizing this, the energy changed its target, aiming for the embryos that hung vulnerably within the hidden world. By now, Lionel had already formed many embryos. A transparent spear stood for his spear embryo. A 12-pointed star silently whirred for his snowy star owl lineage factor. A bronze-violet halo represented his metal synergy lineage factor. Among them, the one that took up the most space was a bow. Harsh and violent cold winds surged around it, making it difficult even to approach. It seemed ready to tear anything that did apart. It was this group that the energy surged toward, ready to tear it apart. Without hesitation, it targeted Lionel's 12-pointed star first. It could sense that its healing characteristic could become a problem should it be allowed to continue. So, how could it not target it first? But it was at the very moment it made contact that things suddenly changed. A hidden scarlet energy was stirred. It had hidden itself deeply within the 12-pointed star. No, it was more accurate to say that they had completely fused. The instant the energy came into contact with this scarlet force, it collapsed. There was no suspense, no hard-fought battle, no teetering on the edge of life and death. Just like that, it was snuffed out. The moment this energy was destroyed, Lionel's eyes shot open, his heart beating heavily as though trying to escape his chest. He sat up, catching Little Black Star before he fell to the ground. Lionel smiled, a sight that looked a bit gruesome considering the blood running down his nose and ears. "It's all right, I'm fine. Lionel comforted the little mink. Lionel wiped the blood from his face with an arm, looking back toward the monument. His gaze narrowed. He realized something. All this time he had been subconsciously restraining his internal sight. But when he meditated on the natural force art, in order to appear within his dream world and the real world at the same time, the only option was to use his internal sight. Lionel had learned from Uncle Montez that wantonly using his internal sight was seen as a taboo in this new world order. So, he had always been careful with doing so. This made him miss the fact that his internal sight was severely restricted beneath the aura of this monument. It wasn't that there was nothing to gain from this monument, but rather that anything worth gaining could only be seen through internal sight. It wasn't even necessary for Lionel to use the natural force art to see it. In fact, the fact Lionel used the natural force art caused him to dive too deeply into the world, which was what caused such an exaggerated backlash. Had he dipped his toes in more slowly, he wouldn't have suffered nearly as badly even if he did a bit. Coming to this realization, Lionel understood the crux of the matter. In this world, without internal sight, it was impossible to cultivate. Due to this, it was both a point of emphasis and something that was easily glossed over. These youths standing around the monument might have already tried to examine it with their internal sight, but because theirs was so much weaker than Lionel's, it wasn't even possible for them to cut through the pressure and touch the monument with their senses. Their only option would be to walk through the pressure personally. However, the pressure here was many times that of the gates. Most couldn't even enter a 5-meter radius, let alone get close enough to extend their internal sight. This made Lionel certain that there were very few in this brave city who had succeeded in doing what he had. And these people in all likelihood had kept this secret to themselves. Lionel was suddenly awakened from his thoughts only to find that 3 people were standing above him. These 3 were of course Jirak, Kyra and Sil. They looked over him with a mixture of confusion and worry. Who attacked you? Jirak was the first to ask. I'm not sure. Lionel shrugged. It was probably just a warning or else I'd probably be dead. Seeing Lionel's nonchalant response, the 3 didn't know how to respond. Was this a way that someone who had just died was supposed to react? Lionel, however, was already thinking of other things. This monument wasn't suitable for him. It was too bloodthirsty and also the general it depicted used a halberd. In truth, the halberd and spear had many similarities, but Lionel had the spear domain to learn everything he needed about the spear. He didn't need outside resources. He needed to visit the other monuments and hopefully find something that would make his breakthrough into the 4th dimension with his soul force allow him to protect himself. Lionel was mostly hoping to find a 4th-dimensional mage. If he couldn't find it within the eastern section of the city, he would have to travel to the other sections even if it meant starting a war. Jirak, Sil and Kyra obviously had no idea what Lionel was thinking, otherwise who knew how they'd react to this madman. Chapter 364. As much as Lionel wanted to ignore everything else around him and focus on the monuments, there was only so long he could dodge Sil. Not long after Lionel found out the truth about the monuments and was planning on traveling through them one by one, the remaining 7 members of the Kiafur family's selections finally made it through the gates. Aside from the petite girl who had confronted Lionel initially who became a royal, the rest were either generals or soldiers. With all of them now here, Lionel couldn't continue to stall Sil and had no choice but to follow her through the eastern sector and into the more luxurious regions. Jirak, why are you following us? Sil said, seemingly a bit displeased. Apparently, she still hadn't forgotten about the words Jirak had said to take advantage of her earlier. Wherever Lionel goes, I go. Jirak said matter-of-factly. Lionel didn't refute this. If things went south, Jirak was maybe the only protection he had. He was under no delusions that he would be able to handle Sil's elder brother on his own. Unless Era had a way to contact her husband, it was unlikely that the Kiafur family heir was even aware of Lionel's existence. And Lionel had a bad feeling that Era wanted it this way. Lionel wasn't oblivious. He knew of the underhanded tricks Era was pulling behind the scenes. One of the things he was best at was reading people. And he wasn't new to women being fond of him. As a 5-star quarterback, there were plenty of women, even those from noble families, who were willing to throw themselves at him. Even though the occupation wasn't as respected, that was only a matter of relativity. Not every woman would be able to find a husband from a 5-star profession of high standing. And as a quarterback, Lionel was guaranteed to become a very rich man in the future. This was all to say that Lionel could easily read the signs of women coming on to him. It was just easier to pretend to be ignorant. But, by now, Lionel realized that if he allowed things to continue like this without stepping in properly, a small misunderstanding could easily become a massive one. The worst part was that he couldn't just step out and say he had feelings for another woman. He was quite familiar with women and saying such a thing bluntly would only make him public enemy number 1. Please come back soon. Lionel looked up into the sky, holding back crocodile tears. Things would be so much easier if Aina was here, even if she was still pretending to not like him. Lionel suddenly smiled. That's alright, I know you've already fallen for me. Sil and Jirak looked toward Lionel's suddenly smiling face, wondering just what he was thinking about. At that moment, the surroundings began to change. From dirt roads and tents, they began to see neat little huts amid smooth roads. Soon, those smooth roads became paved in stone and the huts became small houses of brick. Even now, one couldn't say these homes were luxurious. They were quite minimalistic compared to true behemoths one might find in the outside world. However, in this place where the only building taller than 3 stories was the massive tower that connected the sectors, this was by far the best place to live. Each home was gated and had a different style, exuding a different aura. Some reminded Lionel of gentle winds, others of rushing water, and still others like raging flames. However, what each house had in common was a single lamppost before its gate. It only took a moment for Lionel to understand that if this lamppost was lit, the house had been claimed. If it hadn't been, then the lamppost wouldn't be. Judging by the current situation, there were much more homes lit than Lionel thought there would be. Were there really this many emperors? Syl hesitated for a moment. Though she knew her brother would be here, she wasn't exactly sure where he would be. You don't want to choose a house? Jirac suddenly asked, glancing toward Lionel. Not yet. Lionel shook his head. Jirac laughed. If I was as weak as you, I'd be hesitant too. Lionel chuckled in response, not minding. How'd it feel to lose to someone so weak? Syl giggled, forgetting about her task to find her brother for a moment. Just as the group was about to continue through to see if they could find any clues, Lionel frowned. He turned back to find a young man strolling through the stone-paved roads. He wore white robes that shifted slightly with his every step. His long, black hair was neatly tied, making it almost impossible to make out individual strands. Everything about him exuded an air of refinement and cleanliness, almost like a diligently polished blade ready to be unsheathed. Syl noticed Lionel's odd reaction and turned back. Her eyes lit up in pleasant surprise. Big brother? Lionel's gaze narrowed. He hadn't expected to run into this man so easily. And most importantly, he hadn't expected that even after overestimating his potential abilities in his mind, that Lionel would still be so surprised by the pressure he felt from this young man. As Lionel was looking toward the Kiefer family heir, he too was looking toward Lionel. The young heir had never met Lionel before, he didn't know who he was either, but he still felt his eyes gravitate toward him. And when he noticed the emperor mark that barely shrouded the black brand between his brows, he felt inwardly surprised. For a moment he forgot to respond to his sister. A sword that hung to his back vibrated slightly, making it seem as though the blade might unsheath at any moment. This was the first time Lionel noticed the sword. His vision had been so focused on the young man before him. However, after a moment he realized why he hadn't. The sword wasn't attached to anything. It floated in the air, following the young man around as though it couldn't bear to part with him. Lionel couldn't imagine the level of skill that was needed to reach such a state. Chapter 365. The atmosphere grew silent. Syl seemed to realize that something was wrong when she saw her brother and Lionel staring down one another. But any word she wanted to speak seemed completely caught in her throat. She felt that she couldn't form the things she wanted to say no matter how hard tried. Ching, ching, ching. The sword to the young heir's back continued to tremble. Some unknown force held it back from unsheathing. Lionel continued to silently watch, sizing up the young man in white before him. Lionel knew too little about the fourth dimension to accurately gauge strength. But he could sense pressure easier than maybe anyone else. Even though this young heir was weaker than Uncle Zimo, considering his youth, Lionel had no doubt that there would come a day when Zimo was completely overshadowed. Suddenly the pressure dispersed. The young heir looked from Lionel to his little sister and smiled lightly. Though the smile was a bit cold, it was filled with a doting air to it. Syl, you're here. The young man nodded. And who is this? Syl shook her head to recover. Sister-in-law recommended him. He's participating as one of us. His name is Lionel Morales. Morales? The young man frowned. He felt something stir within him as his thoughts drifted toward a certain memory. But he didn't remain in a trance for long. The universe was too big, those sharing the same name were far too numerous. Of course, those who were on the same level as certain families wouldn't dare to share the same name. For example, there was no way someone on Terrain would take the Kiefer family name. Such a person would be asking for death. However, there might very well be other fourth-dimensional worlds where the Kiefer name was used. The influence of the Kiefer family wasn't large enough to instill that kind of fear. This was all to say that it was a matter of perspective. And to put this matter into perspective, the fact that this young heir even paused at this name meant that his scope was already far beyond those usually found on the fourth-dimensional plane. A higher dimensional world wouldn't care what ants beneath them did. But the young heir knew that if by some miracle this Lionel Morales really made it to such a height, he would definitely have to change his name unless he wanted to be hunted down and executed. This matter was definitely not as rare as it seemed, and no small number of stubborn individuals had suffered. However, the young heir didn't bother to tell all of this to Lionel. Such a thing was far too distant in the future, and the likelihood that Lionel would ever reach such a level was slim to none. The young heir nodded. So Era decided this. The young heir was quite familiar with his wife, so he had a good idea of what she was thinking. But taking care of someone in the third dimension, no matter how talented they were, would be difficult. Even he didn't dare to enter Brave City until he had grown to a certain level of strength. Is there a reason the Black City heir is here? Sil's elder brother asked. Jirak snorted. The only difference between me and you is that you're a bit older. Is there a need to stick your nose so high into the sky? Still, even the usually boisterous Jirak didn't dare to say these words aloud. Though this young heir seemed refined, anyone who had heard of history knew that he was a madman. He's with me, Lionel replied, seemingly noticing Jirak's apprehension. Oh. The young heir didn't ask anything further. The situation right now is a bit delicate. The trials will begin in another month, but that doesn't mean the city is safe. In fact, this is maybe the most dangerous time. There's a good chance that a territorial war could be sparked. Lionel scratched his nose, pretending as though he didn't plan on being responsible for starting one. Be sure to stay within the limits of the eastern sector. And if you are going to the central tower, travel in pairs. Also, be cautious of the monuments. Lionel's eyes narrowed when he heard this, but didn't say anything more, waiting for the young heir to finish his spiel. After a while, Lionel suddenly got curious about something. What benefits are there to a territorial war? There's got to be a reason for them, right? The young heir swept a glance over Lionel. Not many dared to cut him off while he was speaking like this. Of course, that was just the young heir's illusion. Lionel had waited for a slight pause in his long-winded admonishment. It was clear that the young heir was lecturing his little sister rather than speaking for all of their benefits, so Lionel asked a question instead. There are 8 sectors to the city. Each has their own residential area and monuments. The only way to access the other sectors is through the central tower. However, due to this, it also makes it very obvious when someone is crossing over to a sector they shouldn't be in. When you enter another sector, it becomes easier to upgrade your rank, meditating before the monuments becomes easier, and the benefits for stealing abodes is also greater. Benefits of abodes. Lionel's gaze sparkled. Yes, every abode makes it easier to cultivate a specific special force. The short of it is that all benefits are greater when stealing them from another sector. But, for this reason, people are also very territorial. Considering your strength, acting on this would only lead to your death. The young heir's words were quite pointed, but Lionel didn't really care to respond directly to them. Lionel found this young heir to be quite odd. At first glance he seemed stoic, cold and quiet, but he was actually quite long-winded. I have one more question. Lionel pressed. Are there really this many emperors? Lionel looked around at all the lit lampposts. It couldn't be that emperors were so cheap, right? Who said an emperor could only claim one house? Lionel's eyes widened. So this was how it was. Thanks for the help, Lionel said with a smile. I'll help out the Kiefer family if I can. I'll be going now. After finishing his duties, Lionel bid his farewells. His thoughts were filled with how to make his imprint as big as possible. If he wanted to be known, there was no better option than attacking other territories. However, Sil's brother wasn't wrong, he was too weak to do so now. He needed a few backup plans first. The young heir's gaze narrowed as he watched Lionel's back retreat, his sword trembling once again. Jirak followed along quickly, not knowing anything about the crazy thoughts going on in Lionel's head. Chapter 366. Hey. Jirak jogged to keep up with Lionel, his heavy armor causing the paved roads to quake. Lionel looked back and couldn't help but smile. You know, for someone with such a strong wind affinity, shouldn't you wear something lighter than this, Baldy? Who knows, your hair might grow back if you stop straining yourself so much. What do you know? Jirak snapped like a cat that had its tail stepped on. Clearly his baldness was a soft spot. It's precisely because I have a high wind affinity that I should take full advantage of it. Who else could wear such heavy armor and yet still be so fast? Lionel shook his head and didn't reply to these words. They sounded logical, but the truth was that Jirak's speed would never reach its full potential like that. Just from what Lionel could see alone, he would easily be 2 or 3 times faster if he took his armor off. On top of that, he would never be as sturdy as someone with an earth affinity either. So, he was essentially becoming decent at many things in exchange for losing out at being excellent in one lane. In a world where your life was on the line at every turn, Lionel felt that this was a mistake. But he didn't press Jirak too much. He still needed a bodyguard after all. So who are you really? Jirak asked curiously, leveling out his steps with Lionel. I told you already, Lionel Morales. Lionel replied casually, looking toward the next monument. You know that's not what I mean. You use a translator, so you're obviously not from this world. I hear you came out of the same carriage as Sil, but you both deny being betrothed. You should probably hide that from that madman, by the way. If he finds out that something like that happened, he might kill you for defiling his little sister. Jirak rambled. I'm from Earth. Lionel finally responded as Jirak had a pause. Earth. Jirak's steps stopped. Lionel frowned, looking back toward Jirak. Is there a problem? No. Jirak shook his head. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Was there a need for such an exaggerated reaction? Terrain was just as bad a name as Earth after all. It could be said that all their ancestors needed some better naming sense. Lionel wanted to say something about Jirak's weird reaction, but he realized that they had already made it to the first monument. On the way to the Emperor abodes, Lionel had already mentally marked the locations of a few monuments. Unfortunately, Lionel was so focused on the monuments before him and how they could help him find Aina that he had completely missed the complicated gaze Jirak looked toward his back with. After a full day, Lionel fell into his thoughts, organizing everything he had seen. The eastern sector had 33 monuments and Lionel had been to them all. However, there were only a minority of them that caught Lionel's attention at all. The first one was of a bowman. Unlike what Lionel had with his spear domain, he didn't have a set path to follow with his bow. However, it would be a shame to ignore his talent for marksmanship. The only issue was finding sources that could help him continuously increase his skill. Of all 33 monuments he had been to, only one of them depicted a bowman. Even now, Lionel could remember her valiant aura and golden armor. She looked like a goddess descended toward Earth. Just from the few scenes Lionel saw, he could tell that she could control the flow of a 10-kilometer radius just with her bow and arrows alone. It was a level of skill Lionel couldn't even imagine in his current state. The second monument that caught Lionel's attention was of another woman. The only unfortunate part was that she was a fire mage and not an earth or light mage. Lionel still remembered being entranced. This woman stood in the skies wearing a fiery red robe so long it extended tens of meters past her feet. Her fiery red hair was of an obscene length as well, whipping about like rays of crimson amidst the clouds. The domain that surrounded her seemed burnt to ash. The air was dry, the ground was black, the wind was scorched. It felt as though one was standing in a perpetual hell just being around her. Lionel remembered being in awe when he came out from the illusion before soon being disappointed. After all, he wasn't a fire mage. And even though he had dream sculpted all the mage arts of Camelot, regardless of element, he had never even so much as used a fire element spell before. However, that was when something shocking happened. Lionel realized that when he looked around him, Jirak and the others who had surrounded the monument at the time had separated their distance to him by a large margin. At first, Lionel had been confused, but when he looked around he found that there was a radius of scorched ground around him. In fact, the only things not burnt to ash near him was the little mink napping on his head without any worries and luckily his clothes. It was then that Lionel came to realization. His Scarlet Star Force. Top 10 amongst Star Elemental Forces. Top 3 amongst Light Elemental Forces. The very best amongst Fire Elemental Forces. Without realizing it, Lionel's affinity for fire magic had surpassed his affinity for both earth and light elemental magic. Whether it was his metal synergy or snowy star owl lineage factors, they were all overshadowed by his innate force node. This could only be expected, after all, a lineage factor is passed down and must be slowly unlocked whereas an innate force node was all to a person's own. Of course, Lionel's Scarlet Star Force also vastly improved his light and star element affinity. Compared to others with light and star elemental affinity, Lionel was amongst the very top few now. However, even compared to that increase, his fire affinity still gained the greatest leap. Even though he couldn't use his innate force node to its full potential now, simply by virtue of having it, all flames in the world bowed down to him. Chapter 367. The third monument that caught Lionel's attention was actually a sword-wielding man. However, this wasn't because of the weapon. Lionel had no interest in switching from the spear. In fact, he found that he was growing more and more fond of the spear every day. There were two reasons this monument caught his attention. For one, Lionel recognized a part of its aura. When he thought about it, he realized that it was very similar to the aura he had sensed on Syl's elder brother. Of course, the aura on Syl's elder brother was far weaker than the one Lionel sensed from this monument. However, it was the same aura nonetheless. As the saying went, it was important to understand one's enemy. Though Syl's brother wasn't yet at such a point with Lionel, Lionel had too much PTSD from organizations he joined betraying him. By this point he was already on his guard and was preparing for the worst-case scenario. That said, if it was only about understanding Syl's elder brother, Lionel wouldn't be so interested in this monument. After all, no matter how much he understood the young heir, it was useless if he was too weak to do anything about it. Ultimately, what was most important was his own strength. However, there was a second matter that caught Lionel's attention. The sword-wielding man had a pair of wings. Lionel hadn't spent much time comprehending Golden Feather Step just yet. But he already understood just how important movement was in battle, especially if he was the weaker party. If one was far weaker in strength but had speed, there would always be a chance for survival. However, there were plenty of examples of stronger individuals suffering at the hands of those much faster than them. This was part of the reason Lionel didn't agree with Jarek's methods. Speed kills. What was exceptionally beautiful about this monument was that this winged swordsman placed emphasis on his speed. His movements and swords were fluid, moving together as one. The flaps of his weapon and the swings of his sword almost looked like breathing. The contraction of the diaphragm, the expansion of the lungs, the suction of air, the relaxing of the diaphragm, the shrinking of the lungs, the expelling of air, in a continuous cycle they flowed into one another, nurturing one another, strengthening one another. Even compared to the other monuments Lionel had lost himself in, he spent an exceptionally long time at this one despite the fact he was only trying to hop from monument to monument as quickly as possible. It was thanks to this that Lionel realized something else his dreamscape battle sense was missing. He didn't have enough fluidity. Right now, his battle sense worked by sensing a change and reacting to it. But that was entirely reliant on his opponent doing something. What if Lionel ran into a patient opponent who shared a similar battle style? How would his battle sense react when it had no information to read? Unfortunately, Dian could only store such thoughts in the back of his mind. Even this most simple version of his battle sense used up so much stamina, he couldn't imagine what would happen if he tried to add fluidity. He couldn't even wrap his mind around how he would do this. Still, this matter of fluidity taught Lionel something most could only learn after experiencing countless battles. Movement wasn't just about evading and defense, it was just as important in attacking. Only when one's steps flowed with one's actions seamlessly would one reach true mastery of their movement. Lionel was exceptionally lucky to grasp this truth before he truly began to study Golden Feather Step. It might even have the time he would need to master this technique. These were the three monuments that had caught Lionel's attention. This was a good result. Unfortunately, there was bad news. After Lionel studied all the monuments, he realized that he had been mistaken. There were no hidden techniques to learn or grasp. This meant that there were no fourth-dimensional techniques Lionel could learn to help make use of his soul force. All the monuments seemed entirely focused on aura and feel, as though it was teaching the disposition a warrior of a certain type should have. However, there were no techniques to glean from them at all. Such a reality left Lionel sighing. There are important lessons to learn, but that's about it. Lionel shook his head. These things weren't as useless as he thought. For example, the core lesson of the winged swordsman would lay a foundation for him in movement techniques that would only exponentially multiply in the future. If Lionel was correct, there were lessons to be gained from the bowman or bowwoman rather, and the fire mage as well. The bowwoman likely taught about control and the fire mage definitely touched upon the concept of a domain. Still, all of these things sounded nice, but now Lionel didn't have an obvious path toward improvement. Without matching techniques, breaking into the fourth dimension wouldn't create as great a boost to his strength as he would like. Lionel looked up to the sky and sighed. It seemed that things wouldn't be as easy as he thought. He needed to talk to the dictionary to arrange his thoughts. After a while, Lionel grit his teeth. He would have to risk it. The only place he would feel safe using the dictionary was in his own protected abode. He would have to put it all on the line and claim one now. If he let things stay as is, he would eventually suffer. Hesitancy and inaction were just as bad as failing miserably at times. Lionel could feel many eyes on him. Many had been watching his every action for a long time now, wondering how long he could hold out. When everyone saw him walking back toward the abode setting, Numerous spies sent to monitor his actions rushed back toward their masters, cold lights flickering in their gazes. Jirac, who had followed Lionel all this time, frowned deeply. He couldn't help but look toward Lionel's side profile. Was he really going to do it now? Chapter 368. Lionel walked along the stone-paved roads once again, calmly observing the abodes and lampposts one by one. He was easily able to see which abodes could help with what. Most were focused on the main elements of fire, wind, earth and water. Aside from them, there were a few rarer kinds that fell into the category of variants. The best sort of abode for Lionel would be a star elemental abode. Only such a place would be highly compatible with him and would make the process of evolving his soul force much smoother. Also, since he wasn't necessarily restricted to one abode, a metal variant of the earth element would also be greatly beneficial to him. This would help him improve his metal body at a much quicker rate. That said, this wasn't at the forefront of Lionel's mind. After all, he had long since realized that the aura beneath the gates and monuments could also work to greatly speed up the strengthening of his metal body. In fact, since the aura beneath the monuments were 10 times more concentrated, they were even better than the gates had been. Lionel continued to walk, quickly getting a bit worried. He saw some variant abodes, but he still hadn't seen a Star Force abode. What are you looking for? Jirac finally couldn't hold back. In his mind, after seeing how devastating Lionel's fire affinity was, Lionel should have long since chosen an abode. They had already passed by 2 fire elemental abodes and 1 variant fire elemental abode. Of course, Jirac had no idea that Lionel had yet to consciously work on his fire affinity before. I'm looking for a Star Force abode, Lionel replied. There was no need to hide anything anyway, since once he found such an abode, practically everyone would know about it. Star Force. Jirac was shocked again. It was difficult to explain just how rare those with star affinity were. They were even on par with those that had enigmatic affinities like time and space. Star Force was the only force in existence that could be cultivated and used no matter the environment. There were many locations in the universe where energy of a certain kind became scarce and impossible to sense. Those who had such affinities that were unlucky enough to end up in such regions could only lament their bad luck and hope to survive. In such environments, even abilities could become useless. However, no matter where one was, there would always be star, space and time force. These 3 forces and the other rare ones like it all had this fundamental reason that set them apart. Suddenly Jirac laughed. No wonder, no wonder. I thought you were a madman for a second, but it seemed you had a plan too. Chem? Lionel raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? You don't have to act ignorant anymore, I see through you. Lionel frowned in confusion. No really? Jirac gave Lionel a weird look. You really don't know? Really? Madman. Just a madman. Jirac grumbled. Claiming an abode requires 2 prerequisites. The first is that you must have the appropriate rank. It's possible for an emperor to claim a king's house, but it isn't possible for a king to claim an emperor's unless they upgrade their mark. The second prerequisite is that the trial of the abode must be passed. Lionel's gaze suddenly brightened, his steps coming to a halt. You mean to say that the trial that must be passed is related to the affinity of the abode? So, if I'm the only one with Star Force affinity? If you're the only one with Star Force affinity, then it would be impossible for anyone to claim your abode other than you unless they're seeking death. The trials are quite simple if you share the necessary affinity, and you can muddle your way through variant affinities as long as it's related to your main affinity. However, if you try to claim a home you have no affinity with, heavy injury is the best case scenario. Lionel's gaze brightened like 2 torches. Was this what they called luck? Was he finally going to get something to go his way? Lionel was a virgin and hadn't even kissed a woman before. In fact, the only times he had even been able to touch Aina somewhat intimately was when she was either unconscious or half dead. But he could swear that being with a woman couldn't possibly feel half as good as he was feeling right now. He almost shed real tears. Jirac gave Lionel another odd look. Why does he look so happy? Why does his expression almost look lewd? Jirac almost began to shed his own tears. He could only hope that Lionel didn't use his control over his life to take his chastity. Of course, if others knew Jirac was thinking himself as chaste, he'd probably be stoned to death. After a moment of happiness, Lionel regained his composure. Even if these people couldn't try to seize his abode, the fact of the matter would be that he would still be unsafe when he left his abode. And he would have no choice but to leave it if he wanted to make his name known to find Aina. In addition, it wasn't like he could bring the monuments into his abode either. However, this was still the greatest news he had heard in a long while. Even if he would still be at risk, he wouldn't have to worry about the 12-hour limit anymore. In addition, should things go south, he had a safe house he could return to. Of course, this was as long as no one else had a star affinity. Soon, Lionel and Jirac made it to the end of the stone-paved roads. For a moment, Lionel thought he had dropped back down to an abyss because even now, he couldn't find a star affinity abode. But that was when his gaze landed on 6 homes that sat side by side. In fact, they were a measure larger than all the other homes. One gave off a radiant gold light. The next pulsed with darkness. The third seemed warped, dilating one's sense of time. The fourth seemed to stand in a plane of its own. It looked as though it was right before them, yet hundreds of miles away at the same time. The fifth made Lionel exceptionally excited. It too exuded a light. But it was more gentle and dense than the first, not to mention warmer. This was definitely a star affinity abode. Finally, his heart rested easy. However, when he looked at the 6th house, Lionel's steps froze again as he fell into a daze. He felt as though he experienced his whole life once again. From the day he was born to this very moment right here. In his shock, Lionel saw the image of a woman gorgeous beyond words. It was the kind of beauty that seized the heart and overshadowed even young Mistress Era. She had eyes as bright as glistening emeralds, hair like a shimmering golden white waterfall, and a smile that made tears uncontrollably fall from Lionel's eyes. She held a baby in her arms, her gaze a mixture of love and unwillingness. The image was so real that Lionel felt as though he was right there. He was the baby, he was the one being looked at in such a way. Mom? Lionel had never said these words in his life. At least, he had never said it to address another person. He never thought about his mother because he couldn't even remember her. He couldn't say he felt one way or another. But at this moment he felt as though his heart was bleeding. How could he forget that gaze? When Lionel snapped out of it, he found himself standing in the same place staring at the same house. Lionel. Well, you're awake. Try not to stare at that abode too much. There've been stories of others never being able to extricate themselves. I've never heard of someone falling into a trance like you did coming out. You're very lucky. Lionel blinked, trying to regain his bearing. But the tears didn't seem to want to stop. That abode, what is it? Lionel forced out, his voice shockingly steady. That? Jirac didn't even dare to look toward the abode as he referred to it. They call it Dream Force. Chapter 369. The moment Lionel heard these words, he felt his mind tremble. After a moment, he wiped the tears from his eyes and shook his head. Lionel's personality was one that was difficult to grasp. It was hard to imagine that a person who seemed so soft-hearted as him wouldn't even spare a single thought toward his mother. It wasn't rare for children who grew up with one or no parents to have fanciful images of what could have been. Of course, some grew out of this phase while others never did. However, maybe very few were like Lionel and never had such thoughts at all. This was maybe one of Lionel's true faces. Though he loved, he also had a deeply calculating side to him. When he told his former best friend James that he would leave Aina alone if she truly rejected him, he hadn't been lying. If the words no ever came out of her mouth or her actions ever made him feel as though she was rejecting him, he wouldn't hesitate to let that part of his heart die. Lionel knew this about himself. Maybe if it wasn't for the love he gained from his father, he could have very well become someone's cold-killing tool. There really wasn't much separating such a person from himself aside from his upbringing. To now, maybe Lionel had subconsciously accepted that his mother didn't want him, so he very logically cut off that part from himself. There was no need to waste time thinking about someone who had no need for him. However, the moment he saw that gaze, everything suddenly changed for Lionel. As logical and calculating as Lionel was, he was just as loving and caring. If the gaze his mother had for him was still the same, then no matter where she was, what trouble she was in, what was keeping her from his side, he would make sure to wipe it all out. It was that simple to Lionel. There was nothing more to think about. Jirac suddenly felt that suffocating aura once again. He could hardly move until Lionel finished going through his thoughts. What is Dream Force? Lionel suddenly asked, his heart growing calm. Lionel needed to know. Was it just coincidental? Or was there a reason behind everything? Jirac hesitated. The Dream Force abode was an extremely enigmatic existence. According to what Jirac knew, it didn't appear all of the time. It would often hide itself as though it was an illusion and rarely appeared. However, the times it did appear usually led to tragedy. There were no small number of geniuses who had lost themselves in an illusion just staring at it. It could be said that Jirac was lucky to not be one of them. He had been observing Lionel this whole time because he thought he was a madman. But then Lionel suddenly stopped and entered a daze. This luckily triggered some of Jirac's memories, so he didn't dare to look where Lionel was looking. But, from what Jirac knew, it should have been impossible for Lionel to wake up. Yet, not only had Lionel woken up, he had only been in a daze for a few seconds at most. This left Jirac more shocked than almost anything else ever could. Could it be that all those legends were exaggerated? They must be. Despite thinking this, though, Jirac still didn't dare to look toward the sixth abode. It's another high-level force. Wherever there are people, there will be dream force. So, in a way, just like how star force is never restricted by location, so is dream force. After all, if you happen to find yourself in such a place, as long as you exist, there will be dream force. But what is it exactly? Lionel asked, his expression having regained an eerie calm. He almost seemed too placid. I don't know much about it. I only heard someone once describe dream force as the representation of consciousness. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Consciousness? How much effort had the scientists of Earth put into finding the source of human consciousness? It was the one thing that even hundreds of years of technological advancement still couldn't describe. Some believed that human consciousness was stored in a soul or spirit. Others believed that everything that represented consciousness could be found within the brain and that we only couldn't describe it because we didn't understand the brain well enough. When Lionel entered this new world order, he sometimes had fleeting thoughts that maybe a soul did exist. He had seen so many fantastical powers in the past year that this was much easier to accept for him. Yet even now, he had yet to find this so-called soul of his. One had to know that soul force was just a name. It didn't represent a spiritual form of Lionel. It was simply an extension of Lionel's senses, another form of energy. Nothing more, nothing less. This was the reason why, even though Lionel knew his ethereal glabella inside and out, he had never run into anything like a soul in there. All one could find were his embryos and his stars. There was nothing else. But what Jirac was saying now was that this dream force represented such a thing. It left Lionel feeling, well, he wasn't exactly sure how he was feeling at all. All Lionel knew was that this was the abode he would be choosing. He didn't even hesitate as he took a step toward it. Jirac panicked. Hey, what are you doing? Lionel smiled lightly. Choosing an abode, obviously. You're going in the wrong direction. The star abode is over there. Lionel smiled but didn't reply. Jirac knew well what he was doing. Whether it was dangerous or not, Lionel didn't care. He needed to know why his heart was thumping like this. It was the same feeling Lionel had felt when he chose Dimensional Cleanse. It was the same feeling he had when he chose Golden Feather Step. Yet, it was several times more potent than the feeling had ever been. Were those names he chose a coincidence? Dream World, Dream Sculpt, Dreamscape, Dream Clone. How much of it was a casual name he had given his abilities, and how much of it was something compelling him toward the right path? Lionel had always believed that his ability and his soul force was inextricably linked. But what if this wasn't entirely correct? What if he was missing something? Lionel took several more steps, ignoring Jirac's attempts to stop him. Eventually, the poor bald Jirac, scared for his own safety, didn't dare approach the house any closer. Though he could stop Lionel by force with his strength, he could see a look in Lionel's eye that made him not dare to do so. Then Lionel crossed the threshold no one else dared to. What he didn't know was that his actions would soon cause an uproar. Chapter 370. Lionel was suddenly bombarded by a surge of force. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The force he was used to was hard to sense, but it was still tangible. Even someone with weak internal sight could feel it as long as the concentration was high enough. But this force, despite being maybe in the highest concentration Lionel had ever seen, still felt unreal. The harder Lionel tried to reach out to it, the more fluidly it slipped through his fingers. It was as though Lionel was on a different plane, observing it from afar. However, despite there being such a surge, Lionel didn't feel like his life was in danger at all. In fact, he continued to walk forward without suffering any setback at all. If it wasn't for the fact he was taking his time to sense the mysteriousness of this dream force, he would have already long since crossed this trial. Before Lionel even realized it, he had made it to the door of the dream force abode. His palm reached out, touching the dark oak of the door. Click. A light clicking sound reached Lionel's ears as the door slowly swung open. At that moment, a shield of protection suddenly vibrated. The lamppost that manned the outside flickered before erupting into a blinding light that shot into the skies. The eyes of numerous elites swung in a single direction. They were all used to the signs of an abode being conquered by now. However, the signs had never been this exaggerated before. In the whole of Terrain's brave city, not a single one had ever claimed one of these special abodes. Lionel, however, had no idea that he had suddenly become the center of attention. He was entirely immersed in an all-new feeling. His body, despite standing on the ground, felt as though it was soaring into the clouds. When Lionel finally snapped out of his odd state, he was uncertain of how much time had passed. But he was no longer worried about a time limit. Compared to the Star Force abode, this Dream Force abode was even more secure. Whereas someone bold might try to force their way through the Star Force trial, Lionel didn't believe anyone would have the guts to do so with the Dream Force abode. Facing something tangible was always easier than facing the illusory. In this abode, it was possible to fall into an illusion without even realizing what happened. If it wasn't for Lionel's high affinity with Dream Force, he would have likely fallen into an endless cycle as well. So that's how it is. Lionel exhaled a long breath, looking around his new home for the next while. He couldn't help but smile. He hadn't had a place he could call home in more than a year now. He didn't know how long he would be in this brave city, but he definitely felt at home here. The whole abode was decorated in white and black. The two shades complemented and danced with one another across the home. It was warm and pleasing to the eye, leaving Lionel feeling content. For the first time, Lionel didn't feel the need to ask the dictionary what was happening with him. He understood that compared to his affinity for fire, light, star, or earth, his affinity for Dream Force existed on a completely different plane of its own. It was so high, in fact, that even without being consciously aware, he had still made use of it before. Whenever Lionel entered his dream world, whenever he used Dream Sculpt, whenever he formed a dream clone. Every time, without fail, without Dream Force as a core, he would have failed. To use something so unconsciously as though he was breathing. Just what level of affinity was that? But, now that Lionel knew what it was and could consciously put it into motion, whoosh! A violent torrent of force surged toward Lionel. He completely expelled all of his normal soul force. It was nothing but a hindrance to him, limiting his abilities and causing him to use more stamina to perform tasks that should have been as easy as breathing. To Lionel, Soul Force and Dream Force were like the lubricants and fuel to a well-running engine. Not only was Soul Force far lower in quality when it combusted, it gave off countless impurities, making its efficiency horrid. Not everyone could do as Lionel was currently doing. Dream Force represented consciousness. Those with low affinity could easily lose themselves, forgetting what was real and what was not. Their memories would become so real that it would feel as though they were reliving them in real time. Their phobias would manifest and hold control of them. Even their loves would become larger than life, enveloping their very beings. The number of pitfalls there were to using Dream Force were endless. Only those innately born with a comprehension of this force could make use of it without losing themselves. And, thanks to his ability, Lionel just so happened to be one of these people. The moment all of his soul force was purged, Lionel felt as though a shackle on his mind had been lifted. Dream Force began to compress within his ethereal glabella, wildly surging about. Lionel wasn't worried in the slightest. The Dream Force he was accepting now, no matter how high level of an energy it was still considered to be within the fourth dimension. With the strength of his mind, it was child's play to accept for him. Whoosh! The force around Lionel kicked up a tempest. Lionel's hair fluttered wildly, his heavy robes billowing. What sounded like shattering glass resounded in Lionel's ears. Lionel's eyes shot open, a bright light making his pale irises seem no dimmer than his mother's bright emerald gaze for a moment. Lionel felt that his mind had never been clearer. He saw the things in the world down to their most basic building blocks, seeing through the foundation even the most complex things with just a single glance. With a flip of his palm, the dictionary appeared once again. The last time Lionel checked the level of his ability, it had just barely crossed into the bronze grade. Though this was still a fifth-dimensional ability with the other limiters on Lionel's body, it hadn't been able to truly shine. But now, ping, subject, Lionel Morales, calculative mind, an ability capable of simplifying the complex. Evaluating power, ping, evolution stage, quasi-silver. Chapter 371. Lionel should have been shocked by this result. After all, the last time he checked, his ability was graded as Tier 3 Bronze. This sort of massive leap should have been completely out of expectations. But Lionel only nodded. This much should have been expected. After purging his soul force, his ability should have already shot up to Tier 6 or 7. Then, after breaking through to the 4th dimension within his ethereal glabella, it shot up once again to quasi-silver. It was very likely that at this moment, he had the most powerful ability on terrain. Lionel closed his eyes, focusing on the changes to his ability. Lionel already knew that he wouldn't suddenly awaken new branches to his ability. His calculative mind ability entirely relied on himself to come up with new ways to use his computer-like brain. However, he could still check to see what improvements there had been to abilities he already created. My dream clone limit is now 17. This was the first thing Lionel realized, as it was the easiest to quantify. 17 might sound like a small change, but it became exponentially more difficult to split his mind the more ways he did so. Of course, it was possible for Lionel to surpass this limit of 17 if he consciously lowered the computing power of each. But in most cases this wouldn't be very helpful. Lionel's overall abilities gained a massive boost. He could dream sculpt in a fraction of the time. The ideas he had to improve his dreamscape and dreamscape battle sense seemed to increase like a never-ending tide, but the most important change to Lionel was that he could see through the core secrets of the things he had dream sculpted. Lionel left his dream world and walked out of his abode. "Jirak!" Lionel called out. By now Jirak was in a pitiful state. He didn't dare to look toward the abode, but he also felt conflicted in his heart. His pride wouldn't allow him to abandon Lionel. He hadn't been joking around when he said he would sign his life over. He was a real man. He refused to do anything that encroached on his ideals for himself. At that moment, Jirak had just been about to turn toward the abode. Even if he got stuck in an illusion for the rest of his life, he would have still followed through on the thoughts of his heart. But who knew that the moment he spun around, a vicious glint in his eyes as though the abode was his mortal enemy, he would hear Lionel's voice suddenly call out. Lionel looked toward Jirak with an amused expression. "What are you doing out there? Hurry up." Jirak stood rooted in place for a long while. "Did I already fall into the illusion? Fuck, my life is over." Lionel laughed and shook his head. He hadn't had a close friend since James betrayed him. In fact, he had very much avoided it, closing himself off slightly. But he felt it wouldn't be bad to have someone like Jirak around, at least for now. Lionel waved a finger, causing a pillar of earth to shoot up from behind Jirak and send him soaring toward the house. Ah! Jirak grabbed onto his ass with both hands, soaring through the skies with a wronged expression on his face. Lionel let Jirak land before the door. No way he was going to catch something so heavy. But this seemed to wake Jirak up from his stupor. You really claimed this abode?" Lionel smiled. "I have some stuff to do before we go again. Just stay in here, it's safer. I'm sure there will be people surrounding this place soon enough." With that, Lionel turned and entered, walking up to the highest room of the abode. Though he didn't know Jirak well, his actions just now were enough for Lionel to take a chance on his character. Even if Lionel was wrong about him, with Lionel's current abilities, he could definitely stop anyone he didn't want spying on him from doing so. Jirak stood in a daze as Lionel disappeared. Bang! Someone tell me what the hell just happened. Within the central tower, numerous meetings just like this were taking place. As though by tacit understanding, almost all emperors and most kings not involved in Lionel's claiming of the dream abode came to this very place. Please calm your anger, young master. All those we've sent to investigate haven't come back. We're unsure of what happened as well. Damn it. The young man in question knew that he couldn't go and investigate himself. If he did so, that would be an act of war on the eastern sector and he couldn't bear this burden alone. It was fine if he sent middling soldiers out to do his bidding. Who would care about a few soldiers? They weren't enough of a threat to be taken seriously. But if he, as a king, made a move of his own, it would definitely stir up some problems. The dream abode had been claimed. The dream abode has been claimed. At that moment, a soldier came sprinting into the tower, almost tripping over his own feet. The entire environment froze. Had it been the light or dark abode, it would have been shocking but easier to accept. Had it been the star, space or time abode, the whole of terrain would have been shaken, but it would still cool down after a while. But for it to be the dream abode, it felt as though everyone had entered an illusory realm of their own. Did they really hear correctly? Rainred Solar, Jilnia Falls and Wheeless Mirage all sat together discussing this very topic. But when they heard the news, they too came to a grinding halt. Then they all looked toward one another and understood something immediately. Their mission this time was far too important. It was so important that they even stopped personally overseeing the capture of that ugly bitch. For such a variable to appear now of all times, they had to find a way to deal with it. Chapter 372. Lionel had no idea about the commotion he had caused. But truthfully, this was a matter of choice rather than one of ignorance. All he cared about at this moment was increasing his own strength. The question laid in how he would do so. At the moment, Lionel sat in the pool of his abode sitting in a silent state of meditation. His mind rushed through several potential plans as he organized himself. The quickest way to improve himself was likely with the 4 Seasons Realm Force arts of Merlin's trials. With the improvement to his ability added atop the help of the Natural Force art, it most definitely wouldn't take him the years he previously thought it would. Lionel had already done a quick estimate. It would take him about a single day to perfect dream sculpt one of them now. And if he wanted to fuse his comprehensions of winter, spring, summer and fall, he felt it would take about a week or 2. In total, if Lionel wanted to grasp the 4 Seasons realm for his spear, bow and fists, it would take about 2 to 3 months. This was definitely a far shorter evaluation than he previously had. The only unfortunate part was that these wouldn't be his own comprehensions. As such, the power he displayed wouldn't be as exaggerated as allowing him to challenge the peak of the 4th dimension. For someone weak, the best thing they can do to keep themselves safe would be to have mobility and to keep a certain distance. Lionel knew this well. So, for now, he set aside the idea of comprehending his spear and fist techniques. During the trip here, Lionel had already completely grasped Chain Domain and conquered his first spear peak. There was no need to spend any more time on it for now. In fact, Lionel was leaning toward comprehending the 4 Seasons realm with his spear on his own. But this was still a matter for the future. Focus on movement and long-ranged attacks. When Lionel came to this conclusion, he had made up his mind. He was able to quickly break down the things he needed to do. The first and most obvious was to awaken the speed branch of his Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. The second was to master Golden Feather Step. The third was to comprehend and fuse his comprehensions of the 4 Seasons realm for his bow embryo. And the fourth was to modify his use of Camelot's spell arts to make them useful against 4th-dimensional opponents. In the past, Lionel didn't have the computational ability to do this on his own. But at the moment he was feeling much more confident. Having made his decision, Lionel's eyes slowly opened. A smile crept onto his face as he watched the little mink float in the pool. The little guy snored away without a care in the world, causing Lionel to chuckle. Lionel entered his dream world once again. This time he immediately split himself into 16 dream clones. Then he assigned 4 to each one of his chosen tasks. As for his 17th dream clone, he had it completely focus on absorbing dream force. The only way to sustain such continuous activity would be to do exactly this. If Lionel was in any other environment, he would likely have to take a break every few hours. This had happened to him during his trip here in the carriage with Era. This was why Era could so clearly tell when he slipped into and out of his meditative state. But the dream abode had such a high density of dream force that Lionel didn't even need to worry about it. And, since he was currently within the segmented cube, he could allow it to slowly gain the characteristics of the dream abode as well. At least for while Lionel was within the 4th dimension and 4th-dimensional dream force was still helpful to him, he could enter the abode or lab setting to gain the same benefits he was now. Golden Feather Step, clones. After asking the dictionary, Lionel conjured up an environment perfect for training movement within his dream world. His dream clones each stood atop thin metal poles barely the width of the balls of their feet. Below there was nothing but an endless abyss. In their minds, the movements of Golden Feather Step were replayed again and again. Each of them tried to grasp the artistic conception of the technique. Lionel had no idea that his thoughts now were far beyond a normal person's. Artistic conception was usually a term reserved for the universe cycles. But, to try and paint a picture without even considering the universe cycles, the outcome would be quite interesting indeed. However, Lionel had always been doing this subconsciously. In the past he had practiced chasing wind without even opening its cover. What was this if not relying on artistic conception? When Lionel chose Golden Feather Step, what he chose wasn't its name or its power, he chose its feeling. Speed branch lineage factor clones, Lionel entered a deep introspection of his body, sensing the shackles that bound his blood. Having access to a particular branch didn't necessarily mean that one would awaken it. However, to now, Lionel had been able to awaken the first levels of both the healing branch and the wisdom branch. The first opening of the wisdom branch was known as blossoming mind. It opened up one's thoughts, increasing speed of thought and solidifying the foundation for further cultivation of the mind. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't gain much from this other than smoothing out his path toward the fifth dimension. After all, his own ability overshadowed any benefits one could gain from unlocking this first shackle. The first opening of the healing branch was known as instant recovery. As long as there was an adequate separation of time, Lionel could instantly recover back to his peak state. It had already been months since the last time Lionel used this ability, but he still had a few more months to go before he could use it again. Luckily, this opening of this branch had the passive ability of multiplying the impact of normal healing, something Lionel had experienced personally already during his battle with Lamorak. The first opening of the speed branch, however, was a special case for the snowy star owl. It had a slight mutation as compared to the normal speed branch of other lineage factors because it was tailored toward winged beasts. It was known as first flight. Chapter 373. Of course, Lionel wasn't going to sprout wings just by unlocking the first of his lineage factors chains. Such a mutation would only occur at a much deeper level of integration. First flight represented the invocation of the essence of the snowy star owl's speed. 4 seasons clones, each one of Lionel's 4 dream clones focused on a different force art. They floated before his main body, each capturing a different scene. Despite the fact Lionel had already been bestowed the winter legendary skill, he still chose to comprehend it on his own again. It was then he suddenly realized something shocking. When he finally grasped winter on his own, he realized it was different from the comprehension Merlin's trial had bestowed to him. It can't be. Lionel froze for a moment. Compared to the comprehension Merlin's trial had given him, the one he comprehended by dream sculpting was several times deeper. In fact, Lionel felt as though he could sense the essence of the seasons as though it was his very own understanding. Lionel was stunned. What limited those who chose the second path of comprehension, relying on another, was that their understanding would never be as deep as the original creator. However, by dream sculpting these force arts, Lionel had integrated this understanding so deeply within himself that it almost felt like his own. Lionel was shocked to his core. When he realized this, he immediately consulted the dictionary. It was only after this that he finally calmed down. So that's how it is. Lionel learned from the dictionary that there were 2 things that distinguished the second and third forms of comprehension. The first was, as Lionel thought, how deeply one comprehended. But the second was how much universal force one could evoke. Universal force was the strength behind the 4 seasons realm. When one comprehended one or all of the 4 seasons, it was possible to use universal force to increase one's strength. This was where the power of the realm came from. When one comprehended a universe cycle on their own, the amount of universal force one could use was far greater than when one relied on someone else. This essentially meant that Lionel was now in an in-between realm. He felt as though the comprehension was his own, but the universal force hadn't recognized it as such. As a result, the power he could evoke from the 4 seasons realm was more than someone who comprehended it with the help of another, but less than if he had comprehended it all on his own. Even though this wasn't as great as Lionel had been hoping, this was still excellent news. The second form of comprehension would have just been a minor boost to his strength, but this was much more of a boon. Lionel's confidence grew as he once more sunk back into his meditative state. Mage art clones. After the increased strength to Lionel's ability, he found that his ability to master force arts had skyrocketed. Not only could he draw mage arts much more quickly than he had in the past, he felt that he could even freelance their symbols to a small extent. Though freelancing lowered the strength of the art, it once again increased the casting speed and gave Lionel much more freedom in battle. However, what Lionel needed wasn't just speed, he needed added strength. There were 2 avenues he could travel down to accomplish this. The first was the layering art. Lionel had already used this art many times in battle. It allowed a mage to stack the same spell multiple times to increase its power. Unfortunately, it had its own limitations. For one, the maximum number of stacked spells for a 3-star Magus art was 3 and no more. This wasn't anywhere near enough to harm a 4th-dimensional entity. In addition, the second problem was time. To layer multiple arts, it was obviously necessary to draw each one of them individually. This would increase casting time and not be conducive to battle. Of course, This second problem overshadowed the fact that it would also take a lot of stamina to layer so many arts. To Lionel, the problem of time and stamina wasn't really an issue. He could cast even a 3-star Magus art in a split second in his current state. The main issue was the limitation of the layering art. If Lionel wanted to go with this option, he would have to research into either making the layering art better or into making his 3-star Magus arts better complements to it. However, Lionel felt he had a much better idea than this. His 4 clones sat in regions of their own, each of them having numerous force arts floating around them. They spanned from the simplest apprentice arts to the highest Magus arts. Every so often they would break down into smaller parts. Anyone watching from the outside would realize that it wasn't that there were apprentice arts and Magus arts floating around Lionel, but rather that the Magus arts were becoming apprentice arts. Lionel continued breaking down complex Magus arts into their simpler forms, them forming them up once again. He seemed to be searching for something, looking for a path forward. Soon there came a point where nothing but apprentice arts remained. Lionel broke them down further. While Lionel was entirely focused on training himself, a month ticked by, then a second. Lionel had unknowingly turned 19, being completely none the wiser. Outside the dream abode, the crowd continued to grow. But if one paid attention, it would become clear that for such a large crowd, the surroundings were eerily silent. In fact, not a single person was moving, as though they had all entered a trance. The higher-ups who sent all of their subordinates here felt a slight tinge of fear, all the legends of the dream abode coming back to their memories. If they weren't certain before, they were absolutely sure now that someone had claimed it. But how could they deal with someone they couldn't even approach? It was only then that the crowd before the abode grew stagnant. From afar, the sight caused many to shudder in fear. While everyone was distracted, though, changes began to occur at the gates of Brave City once again. The first period of entry for Brave City was known as the quota period. In this period, every family, city and power would only allow a certain number of individuals to enter. This was the calmest state Brave City would be in during its active period, but it also only allowed a limited number of individuals to benefit. After this period ended, the second period would begin. During this time, restrictions would lift. But the danger would multiply several folds. Whereas in the beginning Brave City exuded a valiant majesty, it now seemed as though blood washed its walls. A suffocating killing intent hung around it, causing the weak to collapse and die beneath the pressure. No small number of individuals who overestimated themselves collapsed, never to breathe another breath. It was when this second period began that Xyler looked toward the massive looming gates with fists clenched and determination in his eyes. He wasn't the only one, but his will seemed to tower over the others. He still remembered Lionel's words that day, "Second place was never an option for me." Blood leaked from Xyler's fingers. "Second place isn't an option for me either." He took a firm step forward, his resolve forming a tangible shield around him. At that moment, approaching from the north, there was another who looked toward the bloody gates in silence. They had a back that hunched grotesquely and were shrouded in a black cloak. The scent of blood that hung around them seemed to rival even Brave City itself. Without hesitation, this figure too stepped forward. Chapter 374. Lionel slowly opened his eyes, exhaling a long breath. He didn't seem to look much different than he had just a few months ago. Lionel passed a hand across his face. He remembered that in his youth he had always wanted a full, connecting beard. But ever since his hair changed, he had stopped growing facial hair. He couldn't decide whether this was a good or a bad thing. Regardless, if his facial hair came out as difficult to cut as his bronzed hair, it might be better that he never did. As things stood now, Lionel wasn't even sure if a full-force swing from Syl's elder brother's sword could cut his hair. It would probably only get worse when he entered the perfect stage. Lionel shuddered slightly, thinking about what it would mean if he had to take a blade with such force to his face. What would happen if I had to kiss Aina with such tough facial hair? Would I pierce her skin? Forget it. He'll just give up on that dream. Just like that, Lionel had gone from a youth who dreamt of having a full beard to one who would stay cleanly shaven for the rest of his life. Sometimes, the dream of a man could only die as he matured. Author's note: a moment of silence for our favorite MC. Lionel walked down the stairs of the dream abode. Not much had been touched in his absence, at least not on the second or third floors. It was only after he made it down to the first that he found Jirak. "You're finally out." Lionel gave Jirak a weird look. It wasn't because of what he said, but because of the enthusiasm he said it with. Was there a need to look so happy? Jarek's expression wasn't one of meeting a friend for the first time in a long time. It was more like he had just spent weeks in a bone-dry desert and finally found some water. The reaction was completely disproportional to the situation. "What's wrong?" Lionel asked. Jarek shook his head and stood up. At the moment, he was no longer wearing his heavy armor and had swapped it out for some lighter clothing. "I felt like I was going crazy. There's nothing to do in this house and I can't even cultivate. If I absorb this dream force, I'd probably end up like all of them." Jarek pointed toward the curtain windows. The sun hardly shone through them at all, so it was impossible to see what was on the outside. But clearly Jarek had taken a peek or two in the past. Hearing Jarek's words, Lionel felt a bit bad. He had brought Jarek in so that he would be safe. But he had forgotten to consider that it would be difficult for Jarek to do much of anything here. With Lionel's protection, it wasn't a problem to stay here and not fall into an illusion. In fact, even if he did, Lionel could still pull him out of it. However, other than this, he was pretty limited. Lionel realized then that he might have been a bit too rash. It would have definitely been better for Jarek had he gone off to claim a king abode for himself. "Wait." Lionel shook his head. "What did you mean by that? Who's all of them?" Jarek smiled bitterly. "Check for yourself." Lionel slowly walked to the windows and pulled the curtain aside. When he saw what Jarek had already previously been aware of, he was speechless. What the hell? There was a sea of people outside his home. Though it wasn't as exaggerated as being within the hundreds, there were definitely more than a few dozen. If such a crowd appeared in a normal suburb of Earth, it would be enough to shake any home owner. Yet all of these people were frozen solid, not moving a single inch or saying a single word. "I guess the protections of this abode are even better than I thought. Let alone challenging it, they can't even look at it. Well, this definitely makes leaving easier." Lionel smiled. He had wanted to become known all this time so that Aina would know to come find him. So, to him all this commotion was good news. Though he could awaken all these people, he had no reason to do so just yet. Without saying a word to Jarek, Lionel made his way to the door and swung it open. Hey, my armor. "You don't need it," Lionel replied. "You." Jarek felt aggrieved, but his armor wasn't something he could put on in a split moment. It was extraordinarily heavy for him. "Come on. You're a wind affinity warrior, that armor is only hampering you." Lionel turned an eye toward Jarek that made the latter shudder. He felt as though Lionel had seen through him completely with that one glance. How'd he change so much? "I need my armor," Jarek said. Lionel frowned. He hadn't expected Jarek to be so set on this. "Fine. Forget it." Jarek smiled somewhat, but it seemed forced as he hurriedly put his black armor back onto his body. It was only after he finished that he sighed a breath of relief as though he had been naked without it. Lionel nodded and they headed out of the door, not bothering to hide their presence much. Considering the current situation, it was already difficult enough to monitor them in the first place. Still, to no one's surprise, those kings and emperors had managed to find a loophole. If one was far enough away from the abode, the dream force couldn't affect them. Realizing this, many left their scouts with special long-range sensory abilities in the central tower to monitor the dream abode from afar. The moment the doors swung open, they had all already been informed. But by the time those gears had gotten into motion, Lionel had already made it to his first destination, the Monument of the Winged Swordsman. Chapter 375. The truth was that no one knew who it was had claimed the dream abode. It was only after seeing Lionel exit that people finally got a look at just who this individual was. So, when Lionel made it to the stone monument, not a single person spared him a glance. Of course, that was only because they didn't notice his emperor brand immediately. Now that Lionel knew his becoming famous was inevitable, he put away his overinflated bravado and went back to his normal disposition. So, not many eyes were on him to begin with. "Jarek, this monument is very useful for you," Lionel suddenly said. "Huh? What?" Jarek's eyes widened, then scanned the surroundings to see if anyone was listening in on their conversation. Lionel chuckled. "Don't worry, no one can hear me but you. It's just a single noise cancellation spell." Lionel had used plenty of these spells to form his maze back during Merlin's random event. Using it now in conversation wasn't an issue. That said, Lionel found that casting the same spells in a fourth-dimensional world had severely lowered effects. For example, a teleportation spell that would have usually carried him tens of meters would be lucky to shift him 1 or 2 meters. Still, for such a low-level spell it could get the job done. It was only after hearing Lionel say this that Jirak sighed a breath of relief. You're a mage? No, forget that. What do you mean this monument can help me? Is there a secret? Of course there is. Did you think that these monuments just stood here to tell you about how many women these generals took back to their tents? Jirak grinned. What better source of encouragement is there than this? Lionel seemed to have almost forgotten who he was dealing with. He almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. The stories written on this monument may or may not be true, I don't know. But what I do know is that the story isn't nearly as important as what's hidden within. You need to brace yourself and touch the monument with your internal sight. Jirak hesitated upon hearing this. The reason most didn't dare to do this was because the pressure around the monument was too great. Internal sight seemed intangible, but it was still connected to one's mind. Under equally intangible pressure, it could suffer damage and cause backlash to its owner. So, under such conditions, not many dared to even test Lionel's theory, let alone going as far as to observe the monument with it. This is something you'll have to figure out yourself, Lionel said. I've already given you all the information you need to know. Lionel sighed internally. He could tell that Jirak had a mental roadblock somewhere, but he wasn't some sort of guru, nor had he known Jirak for long enough to extend advice to him. Maybe to Jirak he had already hidden it well. In truth, most wouldn't be able to pick up on it at all. The fact Lionel had was just a testament to his observational abilities. With these words said, Lionel took several steps forward and entered the aura field of the stone monument. It was only after he did this that many turned a curious eye over to him. An emperor? It had to be known that emperors and kings were almost all accounted for. Gathering information on such people was usually the topmost priority of anyone within these city walls. For them to not recognize such a person. Just who was he? The second phase had started not long ago. Could it be that there was someone hidden within the general population with such talent? No one here believed that they had really missed out on Lionel. It must be that he was new. And if he was new, then that must be that he had entered without a quota during the second phase. And, by extension, that must be that he wasn't a part of the city lord structure or the powers. There was no way such a talent would be abandoned without a quota by such powers, right? But, wouldn't they have also known that a new emperor appeared? After all, there was only one gate in their eastern sector. As these people were trying to think about who Lionel might be, he had already crossed the 5-meter mark toward the stone monument, causing their eyes to almost bulge out from their sockets. It was no problem for an emperor to enter such a close range. The issue was doing it so quickly. It was as though Lionel wasn't even feeling any pressure to begin with. In the blink of an eye, Lionel had already become the closest to the stone monument. Yet he didn't stop. He strolled forward, soon becoming so close to the monument that he could reach out a hand and touch it. By now, even Lionel was feeling impossibly great pressure. His bones creaked and his muscles tensed. However, compared to others, he was much more leisurely for one specific reason. He felt none of the mental pressure others did. With a leap, Lionel jumped toward the top of the monument. A green light lit the bottoms of his soles. 2 more jumps later, he landed atop the tall monument. Lionel's body shuddered when he touched the monument. His blood seemed to roll in reverse, but his strong body withstood it. He forcefully suppressed it and sat down in meditation under the astonished gazes of all those around him. It wasn't long before Lionel had completely forgotten everything in his surroundings, his mind becoming as calm as the surface of a lake. Who knew that the moment Lionel settled into a rhythm, a blinding pillar of red light would shoot up into the skies from the direction of the central tower? No matter how shocked everyone was by Lionel, this red pillar took up all of their attention. Someone was invading their eastern sector. The only person who didn't seem to react to this at all was Lionel, who continued to meditate. After all, he had already guessed that something like this would happen. A red pillar wouldn't appear for anyone at and below the royal rank. The only explanation was that kings and emperors had made their move. And they were obviously coming for him. Chapter 376. Lionel's mind was filled with visions of the winged swordsman. It was quite a beautiful sight to behold. Every motion was smooth and flowed into the next. The flap of his wings, the intake of a breath, the swing of his sword. His steps, his force, his thoughts. It was all in perfect union. The longer Lionel watched, the deeper he dove into the world. He could feel the familiar energies trying to assault his mind. But, compared to the past where he nearly died, it almost felt like something was tickling him. The capacity of his mind was simply too far beyond what it had been in the past. Eventually, Lionel felt that he had been far too cautious. Without hesitation, he began to reflect on the natural force art that called his dream world home. In that instant, he no longer felt like he was an observer. It was as though he had taken over the body of the winged swordsman. He even felt like he was a master swordsman, ruling over the world with a single blade. Lionel was very familiar with this feeling. Every time he began to comprehend a new spear, this was exactly the same feeling he would have. The artistic conception engraved itself into his mind. It's a much higher level of movement control compared to the primitive man. Lionel's heartbeat slowly descended, reaching a calm state once more. In fact, he felt as though the pressure the stone monument had on him was lessened by several degrees. The primitive man taught Lionel the value of body control. When he ran, the movement of his arms and torso were just as important as the movement of his legs. When he used his hands to attack, the placement of his feet and the torque of his hips was just as important as the placement of his arms. This was a comprehension Lionel had slowly built upon the more spear consciousnesses he absorbed. If he went back now, the deficiencies of the primitive man were too many, the most blatant of which was the fact this consciousness only focused on the body but not enough on force. However, regardless, Lionel was endlessly thankful for the foundation the primitive man gave him. Thanks to this foundation, Lionel felt that he could grasp the mysteries of this winged swordsman with much more ease. There's something I'm missing. This feeling is definitely very important to this world, but I know nothing about it. I'll have to ask the dictionary about it when I have time. Lionel opened his eyes and smiled, feeling very satisfied with his gains. He didn't expect to master the secrets of this stone monument so quickly, but this was definitely a good thing. It seemed he had underestimated the benefits his ability had bestowed upon him. This made Lionel even more eager to move on to the next monument. Much like the primitive man was a great foundation for this winged swordsman's stone monument, Lionel felt that the primitive woman's consciousness would be a great foundation for the bowwoman's stone monument. Lionel still didn't know much about what Camelot called the general star even now. But he felt if he comprehended the bowwoman's artistic conception, he would come to a truer understanding of just what it meant to be a general star. Lionel hopped down from the stone monument and walked toward Jirak, completely ignoring all the gazes around him. Jirak, you stay here. They'll be going to another stone monument. Jirak didn't know how to respond. Before he could say anything, Lionel had already vanished into the distance. Unfortunately for those who had come to learn more about the person who claimed the dream abode, they had run into a bit of a sticky situation. Just when they wanted to charge into the eastern sector, they found a white-robed young man in their way. The young man didn't say much. He simply stood there, his aura calm. Despite the fact there were several kings before him, he didn't say a single word. It was as though these kings really weren't worth much of anything to him. The kings froze when they saw such a scene. Anared, what do you mean by this? One of the kings narrowed his eyes. Clearly he recognized this white-robed young man. In fact, if Lionel had been there, he too would recognize this young man as none other than Syl's elder brother. What do I mean? Anared's expression remained placid. You're invading my sector yet have the face to ask that? Stop twisting the facts, Anared. You know exactly why we're here. Oh? And I'm supposed to just allow you through to satisfy your own curiosity? And then what? There's only me here yet so many of you, I'm just supposed to take your word that you'll take a look and then leave? Do you take me for an ignorant fool? The expression of the kings flickered. Even if their main purpose here was to find out who owned the dream abode, there was no way that some of the more sinister among them hadn't thought of taking advantage of the situation. After so many of them flooded into the eastern sector, how could they possibly defend against them all? There were bound to be numerous benefits. At that same time, Anared's words spoke to something else. Before, Lionel had asked Anared if there really were so many emperors after seeing the state of the number of lit lampposts. Back then, Anared had simply answered that there was no restriction to the number of abodes a single emperor could claim. But what Lionel hadn't realized back then was that there was only ever Anared. There were no other emperors in the eastern sector but Lionel himself. Fine. They won't enter then. But what about us? At that moment, Anared's expressionless visage became a hint more serious. The emperor-level characters had made themselves known. Chapter 377. Rainred stepped forward, the crowd of kings splitting for him. He wore the same black robes accented with deep blue soft armor. He was a young man of charming looks and a somewhat dark gaze. And unlike in the past, he wasn't followed by either Jilnia nor Wheelis of World's End Falls and Mirage Pavilion respectively. That said, he hadn't come alone either. He was followed by another pair of woman and man. Though, unlike Wheelis and Jilnia, who couldn't have been more different from one another, this pair looked strikingly similar. At a glance, it was easy to make out that they were siblings, fraternal twins in fact. This pair of twins walked side by side, their shoulders practically rubbing against one another. And judging by their demeanor, they most definitely weren't subordinated to Rainred either. At the end of the first phase, there had been 7 emperors total. Lionel, Anred, Rainred, Jilnia, Wheelis and these twins. The Moon siblings. For 2 emperor-level talents to appear in just one family, one could imagine the luck it would take. And most could only do exactly that, imagine. The Moon family, however, didn't have to do this. They birthed a brother-sister pair just 40 or so years ago that carried the hope of their future. Since this was a family, it was no surprise that they were a part of the city lord power structure and founded their strength upon governance and commerce. However, Anared and the rest of the Kiafer family had known for a long time that the Moon family had been leaning toward the powers for a long time already. Still, this situation likely had little to do with their affiliations. They were most likely just as curious as everyone else who this mysterious person who managed to claim the dream abode was. The truth was that even Anared only had a good idea of who it was. After all, as far as he was aware, there was only one other emperor. However, he had yet to confirm it, mostly because he too didn't dare to casually approach that abode. That said, that appearance of this person coincided with that young man's disappearance. Fine. If it's only you 3, I can accept it. Anared replied calmly. However, if any others try to take advantage of the situation, don't blame me for being rude. The sword that floated to Anared's back vibrated wildly as though thirsting for blood. Beneath his might, several kings paled, unable to gather up the courage to battle. The sister Moon sibling smiled. Her lips were such a bright shade of red that it seemed she had just been sipping blood from a wine glass. Lead the way. Her voice was so sweet it almost made one forget the tension in the atmosphere. Everyone here was intelligent. It was obvious that if Anared had a choice, he wouldn't allow any of them through no matter whether the number was small or not. As emperors, they had all participated in the Brave City trial before, so they knew what kind of advantages a successful invasion could give. Under normal circumstances, no one would ever give an enemy even an inkling of a chance at gaining an advantage. However, whether it was because he felt he couldn't face so many enemies or whether he wanted to conserve his strength, Anared didn't want to set off the sparks of war just yet, at least not until the 3rd phase. Anared turned and started leading the 3 of them toward the Emperor abodes. But before he could get very far, he heard another familiar giggle. Young heir Kiafer, you don't need to insult our intelligence like this, right? You're going in the wrong direction. The sister Moon sibling spoke again, her voice light and airy. It somehow both made one comfortable and cold at the same time. Anared's step paused. Since you know where he is, point me in the right direction. His voice didn't give way to any embarrassment. He really didn't know where Lionel was. But the 3 emperors who followed him shared a knowing glance. With the strength of these 4 emperors, it wasn't a surprise that they didn't take long to find Lionel. However, when Anared's gaze landed on him, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. At that moment, Lionel was the center of everyone's attention. He sat atop yet another stone monument, completely lost in his own world. Compared to his emperor brand seemed particularly dazzling, obscuring the black monitoring mark that was once the centerpiece of his face. Even when everyone was shocked by the sudden appearance of 4 more emperors, Lionel was unmoved. Or rather, it was more accurate to say that he didn't spare any of his thoughts toward them. Though he knew 4 more individuals had appeared, he didn't stop his meditation. Rainred and the twins were stunned for a moment. 3rd dimension? The sister Moon siblings' words were just as gentle on the ears as usual. However, this time, rather than just being calming and cold, it felt as though a bomb had erupted amidst the crowd. Do you know who he is? Rainred looked toward the Kiafer family heir. Anared sent a non-committal glance over. He's the seated participant of my Kiafer family. He is courting my younger sister. The 3 emperors froze. However, it was then they remembered. There was an emperor that entered the eastern sector during the 1st phase. The commotion the young man caused was not small. In fact, the whole city quaked. Unfortunately, since then, no one had heard from the young man at all. And this young man had also ignored the unspoken rules and had yet to visit the central tower. Over time, There had been so many things to deal with that this young man floated to the backs of their mind. Rainred frowned as he observed Lionel. This made things even more troublesome. The good news was that this emperor was still in the third dimension. This wasn't much to worry about. But there were certain things during the trial that wouldn't strictly rely on strength. In addition, he wouldn't be easy to deal with regardless thanks to Anared's protection. Wait. Rainred's eyes narrowed. Isn't that a monitoring brand? Why does your seated participant have such a thing? It was difficult to spot beneath the Emperor brand. But after noticing it, it was hard to unsee it. However, Anared's response was just as cool and collected. Is there a rule that said someone who's branded can't participate? You know as well as I do that this brand only means he is being monitored, not that he is a criminal. In addition, it will only be for a period of 3 years. That isn't what I meant. Rainred responded. Why would someone of your family be under suspicion? And why is it that I didn't know that your family had recruited such a genius? Is there a need for you to know everything about my family? Anared's gaze sharpened in warning. All right. The Sister Moon sibling got between the two. We only came here to form relationships, not break them. Can't we just have a conversation with him? What do you say, young man, will you come down? The final part of her words were aimed at Lionel. On terrain, no matter what man heard a request from such a beautiful lady, they would likely do their best to please. However, despite the words traveling to Lionel's ears, he didn't react. How rude was it to ask someone in the middle of meditation to come down and talk for your own convenience? Had Lionel not been able to split his mind, the act of the Moon Sister sending her voice toward him like this could have caused him to suffer backlash. An awkward silence fell over the stone monument region as Lionel continued to meditate. At that moment, the ever-silent Brother Moon sibling suddenly opened his eyes, a murderous glint lighting them. Chapter 378. Even among those of terrain, the Moon siblings stood out. They had flowing silver hair, overly pale skin, and a pair of red lips that seemed to drip of blood. If Lionel cared to observe them during the critical juncture of his comprehension, he would definitely assume them to be the vampires of legend and give himself a good chuckle. That said, seemingly going with this theme, when the Brother Moon sibling opened his eyes, the murderous aura seemed to be perfectly in line with this. It seemed that even compared to Anared, he was that much more protective of his own sister. Just when he was about to make a moon, his sister pinched the sleeves of his silver robes. The Brother Moon sibling looked toward her, wondering why it was he was stopped. There was nothing he hated more than this. Had it not been for the fact they were family, maybe this would have been enough for him to lash out. However, his sister didn't explain. She simply looked toward Lionel, the smile on her face not fading in the least. Brother can't even approach the stone monument so closely. It's not a matter of not being physically capable, but rather a limitation of our minds. If Brother really attacked now, he would be at a great disadvantage almost immediately. It seems that this man was already aware of this. This made everything more complicated. Despite being out in the open, Lionel was probably in the safest place he could be with the exception of his own abode. At that moment, a group came rushing in, seemingly finding out about all the commotion. Big Brother? Syl's voice rang out from amidst them. But before she could say more, she was stunned silent by the sight of Lionel and 3 other emperors. The other seated participants of the Kiefer family rushed in after her. Though they were here to participate, another one of their tasks was to protect the young family miss whenever they could. They had had their hands full over the last few days trying to keep Syl away from the dream abode. But this time they couldn't stop her at all. Anared swept a glance over them that made them shudder. They knew he was reprimanding them for failing their task to keep her away. Come here, Syl, Anared said somewhat coldly. He felt safer when his sister was right by his side. At that moment the situation suddenly changed. Everyone's gaze unexpectedly shot away from Lionel and toward the eastern sector gates. Someone was crossing the second phase trial? Though it was true that Lionel's actions were a far greater rarity, someone passing the second phase was definitely a major event as well. They all watched as the gates trembled. They could sense the perseverance of the person on the other side. One could imagine the hardship one needed to face to cross the bloody aura of the second phase. It took several moments, but eventually, the smallest soldier doors shook open, cracking open just a fraction. A figure squeezed through, his appearance disheveled and bloody. But that was when something heart-wrenching occurred. Just when the figure was almost all the way through, the doors slammed shut, catching the ankle of their right foot. An agonizing scream shook the eastern sector as the person collapsed onto the dirt roads of Brave City. Blood pooled at their legs, dyeing the ground a harsh crimson as the figure convulsed. The amount of perseverance it took to cross the barrier of aura was astronomical. It was no surprise that this person had no energy left. To deal with such an injury at such a time, everyone was stunned. But they couldn't have expected for the silent, unmoving Lionel to suddenly awaken at that moment. Seeing the situation, Lionel stood, his body shooting forward. In that moment, if one wasn't looking closely, it would feel as though a bird had just soared over their heads. The pupils of the four emperors all constricted at once. The Bowwoman's stone monument was quite close to the gates. And due to the fact that all the abodes in this region were just various sized tents, there was nothing obstructing their view right to them. In what felt like an instant, Lionel appeared beside this person. Xyler. Lionel mumbled. At that moment, the familiar face shook on the ground. He seemed to have gone into shock. As a warrior of the fourth dimension, such an injury should have been painful, but definitely not to the point of putting him into such a state. The only explanation was that Xyler had given his everything to reach this point. He didn't have any more energy left to give. Lionel's body suddenly burst with a blinding golden light. Light elemental force surged toward him from all sides. For a moment, his flowing bronze-gold hair made him look as though he was a deity. Even compared to the past, calling upon the light element was far easier for Lionel. In fact, he felt the difference was easily tens of times. Part of this was because of the strengthening of his mind, but maybe the most important part was his innate force node. Grand Heel. A surging wind shook the surroundings. If one looked closely, it was possible to see that in addition to the main force art, countless smaller ones hovered around Lionel, feeding into the main force art as though playing an important supporting role. Under the stunned gazes of everyone, Xyler's shivering slowly came to a stop. And then, his severed leg began to slowly reform itself. Though it failed to regrow in a single attempt, Lionel cast Grand Heel again before coming to a stop. He knew he could continue, but this was enough to stabilize Xyler's situation for now. If he really did continue, he would drain his stamina and then he wouldn't be able to guarantee his own safety, let alone Xyler's. Lionel felt somewhat guilty for his current situation, so, of course he would do his best to help. Lionel propped the unconscious Xyler up, piggybacking him. Though the little mink was a bit unsatisfied with its sleeping arrangements being disrupted, it clambered up to the top of Lionel's head and made another bed for itself. With that, Lionel began to walk back, his hands clasped under Xyler's thighs. However, it was a given that those emperors wouldn't just allow him to walk back to his abode. How could they give up this opportunity? Getting over her shock, the Sister Moon sibling stepped forward. So, are you free to speak now? Chapter 379. Lionel's steps paused. He really didn't know what these people wanted to talk about. It seemed more to him that they wanted to find an excuse to do something to him. However, Lionel didn't care about any of this. He gave the Sister Moon sibling a dazzling smile. It was so genuine and light that it made her heart stop for a brief moment. My name is Lionel Morales. I am a citizen of Earth. This brand on my forehead is an unfortunate circumstance. I just got unlucky in coming here during a period of time they were monitoring for fugitives. I'm sure as citizens of Terrain you know more about this than I do. Lionel thought to himself for another few moments. I believe that is all. Make sure to spread that far and wide. Lionel didn't speak particularly loudly, but his voice resonated, reaching the ears of all those within the square. The atmosphere seemed to freeze. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Did he say something wrong? It can't be that racism is a thing in these places? No, that shouldn't be it. Lionel saw plenty of people from other worlds coming to Terrain. If they weren't alright with such a thing, why would they make it such a big staple of their culture? The four emperors were shaken once again. Lionel was filled with too many surprises. Claiming the dream abode was already enough to shake them to the core. Having a light elemental affinity so high on top of that was enough to make them green with envy despite how well they tried to hide it. But even compared to all of this, the name Earth seemed to shake them all the more. Feelings of jealousy, animosity and disdain swirled in the air. This wasn't a matter of nationality or racism, as odd as it seemed to say this after describing such vitriol. Earth and Terrain seemed to be on two opposing sides of the spectrum. While the common citizens had never heard of Earth, the elites of Terrain all had. Terrain was reaching the end of its growth potential. Earth had an endlessly paved road before it. Terrain didn't receive the support of higher-level worlds, Earth received the support of countless. Terrain was entering a crossroads that might end their world as they once knew it, and Earth was just beginning to bud. The more one compared, the more striking the differences became. Did you just say Earth? Rainred's gaze narrowed. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Yes. Rainred's gaze narrowed even further before looking toward Anared. Is this how your Kiefer family operates now? Allowing those of other worlds to partake in our resources? A slight hint of animosity hung in the air. Regardless of what side you were on, the idea of someone stealing away something that was rightfully yours wouldn't sit well with you. It only made it worse that Lionel was in the third dimension. Those who wanted to partake in the Brave City trials but weren't part of the major powers of Terrain had to wait to the second phase. But who would believe that someone in the third dimension could do this? The contrast Xyler provided was too drastic. Everyone could tell that Xyler was strong enough to become a royal at worst. Yet, he was branded as a soldier now and had no choice but to abide by the rules of a soldier. If Lionel had gone through the second phase like he was supposed to, it would have been impossible for him to become an emperor and all the more impossible for him to claim the dream abode and put them in such a passive position. Anared's gaze remained indifferent. The matters of the Kiefer family are ours to deal with alone. Since when was it the turn of the Cliff's Edge Terrace to speak on our matters? And, I'm also certain that if one were to pick out a traitor to our world, it most definitely wouldn't be me. Rainred's glare froze. Clearly he hadn't expected such pointed words from Anared. All the while, Lionel was lost in his own thoughts. If I go back and pass the trial of the second phase, my name would spread far and wide, right? Ana might hear about it. Lionel thought for a moment. With his intelligence, he could immediately see the animosity aimed toward him. And when he noticed the glances toward Xyler on his back, he managed to put it all together himself. Just when Lionel planned on acting on this though, he paused and grinned. Hate moves more than anything else. Last I remembered, you're an emperor too, correct? Lionel looked toward Rainred with a childishly innocent gaze. If you want my abode, go claim it. Suddenly, Lionel's warm smiling face became extremely punchable. In fact, I think I'm in the mood to claim more abodes. They'll be taking over the Star, Light and Darkness abode. After I do, you can feel free to challenge any one of them. Lionel pondered on something for a moment. Now that I think about it, don't you also get some benefits for challenging an abode in enemy territory? You should want it too, right? Lionel's smile never faded despite sensing the animosity in the air. Anared's brows furrowed, not quite understanding what Lionel was trying to do. Was he really just so arrogant? You don't believe me? Lionel blinked innocently. The crowd was riled up. They wanted to see nothing more than Lionel falling flat on his face. But, at the same time, they wanted to beat him up where he stood. The conflicting feelings left them feeling so stifled that several almost coughed up blood. Just as Lionel was about to boldly lead everyone to the elite abodes, the city shook once again. Everyone's gaze shot toward the northern gates as they blasted open, causing the whole city to quake. As though this was a catalyst, the central tower flickered. A mass of energy converged toward the peak of the tower. At first, the form they took was blurry, but it soon became a row of numbers that read, 9:23:59:59. A countdown to the third phase had begun. In that moment, the suffocating aura around Brave City began to slowly weaken and anxious soon-to-be spectators excitedly stood. It seemed that the true trials would be starting soon. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.